Thank you all for joining today's CMDB workshop. We're going to have a great interactive session here today. Everyone's audio has been muted. If you have a question in the Zoom, you'll see a Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. Please use that, and we have lots and lots of gurus on our call today to help answer any questions that you may have. Any questions that we see that are very common, we will stop the session and we will answer those live as well. And of course, since this is a virtual meeting, right, of course, you can take a break whenever you need to, but of course, don't be gone for too long because we have a lot of great material to cover. Everyone will be receiving a copy of the presentation that we're doing today, as well as a recording. And those who are just joining, who didn't hear me earlier, the lab guide is available at either of these two URLs, which are case sensitive, by the way. As well as here is the link that you can register for your lab instance. Any questions that you may have, once again, please put into the Q&A. As we go throughout today, please do the same. So with that said, let's get started. So the first thing we want to do is just give a brief introduction for all three of our speakers today. So Rico, if you could, can you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Good morning to everybody. My name is Rico Centeno. I'm a senior advisory solution consultant for ServiceNow, primarily focused around all of the IT operations technologies for ServiceNow. Been in the space probably for well over 20 years in the software industry, focusing a lot of my time in the network performance monitoring, system performance monitoring, and hardware performance monitoring. So I've been with ServiceNow about 4.5 years or so. I am married, have 3 kids. I'm based out of Michigan. I do cover all of the Great Lakes region as well as the Southeast region of the US. And just a little tidbit about myself. I am a certified pyrotechnician. I do like working on cars and vehicles, and I like to fly drones. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Rico. And Mike, please.
Let me make sure I'm not on mute. So my name is Mike Gallagher. I am an advisory solution consultant here at ServiceNow, working again on the IT transformation team. My background, I've done 20 plus years in the technology industry, and I've worn just about every hat you could possibly wear over that time. I love to tell everyone I have an invisible propeller. I love to solve business problems with technology. And again, another little tidbit about me, I train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with all 4 of my children. So we never have a dull moment around my house.
Awesome, thanks, Mike. And last but not least, so I'm Steve Emerson. I am an advisory solution architect on our IT transformation team. I focus primarily in the areas of IT operations management and IT asset management. I've worked in the technology industry for over 20 years. I've been in the ServiceNow industry for about 7 years as a customer, a partner, and an employee. So I own the platform. I was responsible for a lot of processes there, including things like building out a CMDB, IT operations management, as well as managing hardware and software licenses. My passion really is making the world of work better for people with ServiceNow. I fell in love with the platform back in 2013, and I've been passionate about it ever since. I just love spending time with my family. I've got a wife, and I've got 2 kids who are in college, basically. And one interesting tidbit about me is that I once was a credentialed media member for the National Hot Rod Association. So I love drag racing. Our agenda for today is really to cover these key areas. We're going to talk about an overview, basically what is a CMDB. We're going to talk about some governance, right? Why it's important to have a governance structure in place to maintain the data that's in the CMDB to make it trustworthy and produce the outcomes that is going to drive, better decisions for your business. We're going to talk about ways to populate the CMDB, as well as some of the newer technologies that we have to make sure that it is populated accurately. We're going to talk about how we manage the health of the CMDB, right? If you put data in there, it needs to be managed, right? And it needs to be trustworthy. So we need to make sure that we manage that properly. And, just like we monitor our health, we need to monitor the health of the CMDB. We're going to talk about how we can help you drive better reporting. as well as making those data-driven decisions off the data that you have in there. And then finally, we'll cover some great resources that we have available for free to customers that you can take advantage of. So that's just a little bit more details on what we do today. But let's start with the CMDB overview. And we're going to kick off today's session with a poll. We want to understand where you guys are on your CMDB journey. So those of you who are using the Zoom client will see a poll pop up. Those on the web, I understand that you may or may not see it, depending on if you have pop-ups enabled or if you have a certain plugin enabled. So basically, we want to understand where you are with your CMDB today, on your journey, right? What is a CMDB, right? Or are you in your planning processes? Are you in your initial steps, or are you full speed ahead? Right. So we're trying to better understand, just get a gauge, because we do a lot of deep dive scans of customer instances to understand where you are from a technology perspective, right? But we're talking about kind of the people, process, and technology perspective here as well. So I'm going to end the poll now, and we're going to talk about the results. And what we see here is about 27% of you, 7% of you say what's a CMDB, right? So that's good. You'll learn a lot here today. About 23% are in planning. About 33% of you are in the initial steps, right? And then finally, we see a lot of you are in full speed ahead, which is great. So what you're going to learn here today is, it doesn't matter if you're just beginning or if you're full speed ahead. What you're going to learn here today can be taken and then applied to your CMDB efforts. Great, thank you, everyone. So let's first start out with, what is a CMDB? First, I'll give you the generic definition, but then I'll talk about what it is, right? So it's really that central repository that acts as a data warehouse for IT, right? So it basically holds configuration data, right? You've got a bunch of servers, you've got a bunch of network devices, as well as many other infrastructure and application components in your environment. And you need to understand what is the configuration of those things, as well as, more importantly, what are the relationships between them. But more importantly, the CMDB really is your digital foundation, right? It's your digital foundation for your organization, but also, of course, for ServiceNow, right? So it is a critical component to making sure that you can drive better decisions across all of the different disciplines that you see here, as well as many more that you don't see here. So for example, the CMDB holds configuration data that will help drive decisions for IT operations management, right? So we find that most of our customers can realize better business value from a CMDB if it has business context as well. So understanding how does this operational component relate back to the business, right? So when you have that level of CMDB maturity, you can easily more understand, well, how do I prioritize my response to operational issues based upon the business impact? When it comes to the most basic thing of IT service management, it's, if I'm planning a change, how do I more accurately plan that change to reduce risk? But also, I want to be able to notify individuals who are impacted by this change more easily, both stakeholders as well as end users. For DevOps, right? A lot of folks have this battle where, do we need a CMDB for DevOps? You absolutely do, right? You need to be able to track everything that is happening from a traceability perspective. When you're standing up new applications, when you're standing up new, infrastructure as code, for example, you've got to track all that in the CMDB, right? Maybe you don't have a change process that has to have a manual approval for that, but you want to have that traceability. From a certificate management and firewall workflows, how do we eliminate outages for expired certificates, which is a huge problem across the industry right now, as well as how do we have visibility into any misconfigured firewall policies, right? Expiration dates for certificates are a huge thing, and we can give you visibility into that. From a cloud perspective, a lot of organizations are moving from on-prem to cloud, right? So how do we gain visibility of all those cloud resources more easily, and then align that spend to any kind of business initiative? And of course, security, right? Security is very interested in the CMDB and oftentimes can help fund a CMDB project, right? How do we, better prioritize response based on business impact of security incidents, vulnerabilities, and so forth, right? So those are just some of the areas that I wanted to call out here today, right? There's a lot of things you see here on the screen that will provide tremendous value if you have a great CMDB. From a basic, from a fundamental perspective on IT service management, our business unit for the CMDB has done some research across customer instances, and as well as speaking to a lot of our customers. And they've determined that with a healthy CMDB, so far, on average, our customers are seeing a 38% faster incident resolution, 82% fewer failed changes, right? I talked about how we can better plan changes with the CMDB that's more effective, as well as 25% fewer incidents per user. And then the one on the end there is really crucial. It's around making sure that you have a healthy CMDB, that a healthy CMDB has less duplicate CIs, right? If somebody goes to create a change request and they see two things in there with the same name, right? I want to make a change to server ABC, but maybe there's two in there, right? You have a duplicate, right? So having all those duplicates really drives down the adoption of the CMDB because people say that it's untrustworthy. So first, we're going to focus on the common services data model, right? Where does stuff go in the CMDB? So we're going to talk about here, what is the CSDM and what it is not. And for those of you who are familiar with our CSDM, it continues to iterate. We started out with CSDM 1.0, I think back in the New York release, and we just released our CSDM 3.0 guidance just back in September for Paris. So I'll talk about what it is first, which is it's really a CMDB framework. It's not a product, right? So it's a set of standard terms and definitions. It is best practices for CMDB data modeling as well as data management. It provides guidance for the out-of-the-box core tables, as well as guidance on how we model services and recommended mappings, or also recommended relationships as well. But what it is not is it's not a final solution, right? So we say that it continues to iterate. We'll be coming out with version 4 at some point as well, version 5, et cetera, right? But it's not a process or implementation guide for any of our ServiceNow products, right? It is not a set of reports either, although you can build some reports against your CMDB to make sure that you're aligned with the CSDM. It's not a piece of code to install necessarily, right? Although with our new Paris release, we do have a CSDM application module. It is also not a product SKU or something we sell, right? So you can't just go to ServiceNow and say, I want to buy the CSDM. It's also not an automatic fix for past implementations, right? So oftentimes we find that customers who have been on the platform for quite some time have had their own determinations of what a service is, what an application is, and have kind of aligned their thinking, right? So the CSDM obviously is the guidance that we want you to use, but it's just no automatic fix to go from what you've done to what is now in the CSDM. So we'll talk about how we, with the CSDM, we have these things called domains, which are essentially functions, right? First of all, the blue area is for design, right? This is really around thinking about the digital products. So it's around designing and planning. Think about from an enterprise architecture perspective, capabilities and applications that are going to be consumed by the business, right? So these are not the things that you would tie to an incident, a problem, or a change. This is more high-level architecture functions. Think that way. When it comes to the orange section, that is the managed technical services. So these are really the deployed instances of those products, right? They are discoverable, right? They have relationships between all the infrastructure and application components that make up those services. And then you can tie it back to the business applications as well as the business capabilities that are in the design phase, right? So this is the more, if you think about traditional CMDB, where you're discovering all of your components, you're relating them back to the business with some kind of service mapping, as well as creating some technical services as well. On the sell consume side of the business, right, think this is really like the customer focused, or who's going to be, it's how we offer up the services that we've built out to our end users, essentially, whether it's our customers or of service of your organization or your internal employees. And then we've introduced this new domain in version 3 called Foundation, right? And if you're familiar with ServiceNow and building out the instance in general, right, this is your foundational data. These are things like your user table, your groups, your locations, your cost centers, your departments. These are things like product models that will support IT asset management in the future. So when you think about it, right, the foundation sits around the design, manage, and consume areas. Expanding that out a little bit more, we see that we have some more details here, right? And I'll talk about this at a high level. This is not meant to be a CSDM course or anything like that. We have a free online training course you could take, as well as you'll start to see some CSDM workshops on the table as well. So when you think about it, right, from a foundational perspective, right, we talked about it already. These are the things where we have your users, groups, locations, company, business unit, department, all basic ServiceNow core foundational data. Then we also have this concept of CMDB groups, which are essentially dynamic-based groupings of CIs that are like. So start to think about how you want to group things together. Start to understand what are your product models that you have to support things like IT asset management, as well as core contracts data. Domain, right? These are your business capabilities. These are your business applications. And I'll show you an example of what this looks like in the real world to get a better understanding. Information objects are things like, okay, show me which applications use which pieces of information, right? Does this application use credit card data, for example? When we get to managed technical services, you can see that we have this application service, right? This is the service that are deployed instances, right? So maybe you have something here for Epic for healthcare. Maybe this is Epic Prod, Epic Dev, Epic QA, or you could have region-based deployments, or you could have version-based deployments. And then these are all of the resources that make that up. Your servers, your applications, your network gear, and so forth. The concept of technical services are essentially groupings of like-kind technical things together, right? So show me all the Windows servers, right? Show me all of the database servers. And that dynamic CI group is introduced in Paris. That's a way to do that more easily. And in prior releases, the technical service used to be something tied only to event management. We're happy to say that this is now available to anybody to use starting in CSDM 3.0 or with the Paris release. And then finally, the sell consume, right? Think about the service catalog, right? How is somebody going to request something that is being offered? And the offerings are essentially different iterations of that service being offered. Maybe you're offering one version to the US, maybe you're offering another version to EMEA or APAC, et cetera. And it all ties back together, right? There's no, as you can see here, there's no lines to any of these other areas because this is all foundational data that ServiceNow relies on, whereas these have relationships between them. A lot of customers like to ask us, well, okay, what tables do I put things in? And what relationships do we set up, right? So with the CSDM, we have a white paper that provides the specific guidance that you're looking for. You'll get a copy of this deck, like I said, so you'll get to see some of this in more detail when you get it. But just think that, if you create a capability, right, you want to understand how do I relate that capability to an application, right? So it's it's essentially provided by, right? So we give you all the different types of relationships. If you use products like ServiceNow Discovery or Service Mapping, the application service relationships are a little bit more automated for you. We don't need to worry about thinking about what those should be. So the healthcare use case example, like I talked about earlier with Epic, business capability, patient management, or medication management, right? If you're a user, if you're a patient of any hospital, these are the types of things that you would be accessing as a doctor, but also as a customer, right? So my chart, right? I have an app on my phone called My Chart, right? That's the application that I'm accessing, right? And then that's provided by this Epic production. You also have Epic QA and Dev, as well as the application cache, right? That makes up, part of Epic, as well as all these servers and things that support it. So again, you'll get a copy of this, and with the CSDM training, there's actually details in there around modeling some of the more common things that you would see out there in the world as well.
Hey, Steve, there were a couple of questions about giving some examples of business capabilities. Is that something that you could touch on really quickly?
Yeah. So think about a capability as something that, that allows an organization to function, right? It's a core capability that we provide to our customers or to our business, right? So I talked about, let me go back to that screen here. So in the healthcare, right, we have a capability for managing patients or for managing medication, right? Maybe it's managing financials. For most organizations who have a general ledger, you have to be able to manage your financials, right? So managing financials could possibly be here, right? And then the application that you use for that, maybe it's SAP Financials would be the application. Thanks, Mike. Okay, we're going to move on to CMDB governance and why it's important to have a governance model in place and a governance team to properly manage your CMDB. Before we get into talking about why it's important, we want to, or I should say how, we want to talk about why it's so important. And it's really tied to making sure your CMDB doesn't fail. So most CMDBs, right, they are deployed with a lack of formality in implementation and governance, right? So you haven't formalized yet like a team or a process, or to manage the data that's in there. Secondly, right, unreliable data sources and lack of automation. Maybe it's just doing manual imports of data, which gets stale pretty quickly, or maybe it's ingesting data into the CMDB, but not going through the proper channels to make sure that it remains accurate. Right, this next one here in yellow is huge, right? It's not driven by goals of the organization. So when you build out a CMDB, it must be aligned to goals, and we'll talk about that during this section here as well. It's customized without understanding what is supported out of the box, right? And this issue here, it can be alleviated today with the CSDM. We understand that in the past, a lot of things, we didn't have support for a lot of areas. So now the CSDM will help with that. Maybe there's too much or too little data, right? So people tend to put way too much data in the CMDB, and then it becomes unmanageable very quickly, right? So we'll talk about how we should only be putting in there the critical few, right, instead of the trivial many. Inaccurate data, right, which always starts to generate a lack of trust in the configuration management process, as well as the data in the CMDB. And then finally, right, it's not tied to other processes like asset change and release management for managing of the data. So in the next few minutes or so, we're going to talk about the 5 steps to successfully deploying a healthy CMDB, right? Keyword there is healthy. And at a high level, right, the 5 steps are setting your direction, building a team and governance model, designing your data model, operationalizing the CMDB, and creating ongoing strategic alignment. And we're going to dive into each of these here, right now. So step 1 is what we call set your direction, right? And it's really any healthy CMDB starts with clear goals in mind, actionable objectives, as well as measurable business outcomes. And so when you're starting to look at your CMDB, you've got to document your approach. But while you're doing that, you need to start to ask yourself what, right? What are we trying to accomplish with our CMDB? How? So what is our approach? And do we have any constraints or assumptions? And then why, right? What business outcomes is a CMDB going to support, which is really the most important question. And then, of course, any transformational initiative, you need to measure, to measure it constantly, right? You need to set KPIs so that you're measuring it to understand your progress so that you can always continuously improve, right? So measurement is critical to the effectiveness of making sure that your CMDB drives value. So one of the things we like to say here is that if you're just turning on a CMDB, right, think about if you're building a plane, right, you're essentially building that plane while it's flying if you haven't set direction up front, right? The CMDB is very much the same. You have to set your direction, and then that is the first key step, or else you're just going to have a big pile of data that may or may not provide any value to your organization. So as part of this first step, we need to identify both strategic company and IT initiatives. And some of those business initiatives, right, that are aligned with your company level might be things like digitally transforming the business or enabling our employees to seamlessly work remotely. Think of today, right? That was a huge thing when COVID hit. And also ensuring business continuity for our customers. Those are just 3 examples. Obviously, each organization has their own things. Secondarily, you also need to factor in what are some of IT's strategic initiatives. So that might be something like, I want to better align IT with the business. I want to understand how all of these components that I'm putting out there, how do they map back to a business initiative? For example, maybe IT is looking at a cloud-first strategy, right, to shift from on-prem to the cloud. Or maybe IT is also looking at improving information security. Right, so when you think about it, right, make sure that you use the same language that your stakeholders use so that you'll get faster buy-in from them and they better understand what you're trying to do. So you're probably asking yourselves by now, well, if I define a strategic initiative, right, how does that actually map back to a CMDB? So there's actually this 3-step process that we follow to help you do that. Or that you can follow yourselves as well. So let's talk about 2 examples, and these are still pretty relevant in today's world. So let's say you have a strategic initiative to enable your employees to seamlessly work remotely, right? Any organization, any government agency, any student education, any hospital, really any large company, anywhere, right? So we basically essentially create some use cases about how we, for that strategic initiative, right? So things like, all right, well, do my employees have the VPN client on their laptops, right? How do we know that? Is the hardware and software that powers my VPN up to date from a security perspective, right? And then also, if I have an issue with a VPN outage, how can I quickly determine where the root cause lies, right? So taking that back to the CMDB, essentially what we need there is an inventory, so accurate and current, right? That's very important. Inventory of the hardware and software for all the end user devices, right? And the entire operational estate, right? So laptops, both, whether it's Windows or Mac, whether it's an iOS device, for example, but also from a infrastructure side, you need to have all of your servers in there. You need to understand this, and the second thing is how those infrastructure and application components, how do they support each other in the business? Second example we want to talk about here is for a retail company, for example, right? When COVID hit, stores were closed, everybody had to buy stuff online for the most part, right? So as a retail organization, how do I continue to serve our customers, right? So ensuring business continuity. So the use cases here could be, because we have such an increased volume in online shopping, so we need to understand how we can prevent outages from occurring. Also, how will we know when we need to add additional capacity before our customers are impacted, right? So maybe you're running low on performance, but you need to understand how all the systems relate back to the performance. To the system that is powering the online store. And also, how can we ensure PCI DSS compliance for any new infrastructure being stood up to support, the additional capacity, right? So those who don't know what that is, that's making sure that we are in compliance if systems have credit card data on them or have access to credit card data, right? So tying that back to the CMDB, we need to be able to track performance over time against the infrastructure and application components that power the online store. Now, I'm not saying that the CMDB is tracking performance, but if you're tying everything back together, relating all those components back up to an application service, you can more easily track that performance over time through a monitoring system, for example. And also, which components have access to that consumer credit card information. Right, so for each strategic initiative, you're going to see that there's lots of different use cases, one to many. And these are just 2 examples, right? So when you start to think about what are my company's strategic initiatives, right? Once you define those, you start defining some of the use cases that are going to be aligned with that, strategic initiative. And then you can more easily determine, well, what type of data do we need in the CMDB to support that? All right, well, now that we set our direction, right, we need to build a team and governance model. Essentially, what we need to do here is we need to set up a CMDB steering committee, right, to ensure that the CMDB continues to deliver continuous value. So this steering committee should have IT leaders that have a strategic decision-making responsibility, but they have accountability for the business. So these are not the day-to-day folks who are actually configuring the systems and making them run. These are leaders who are close enough to the day-to-day operations, but also have a responsibility back to the business. Right. So this is the team that's going to help articulate how the CMDB will support the strategic initiatives of your business. And it's extremely important to get early buy-in from any executives so that you can create credibility and trust in the efforts that you're building. But also you need to give your team the support it needs to drive that change, right? What's the sense of putting a CMDB in place if no one is going to use, if no one in the organization is going to use it? This was a huge challenge when I was a customer, was trying to get the buy-in for the IT organization to use the data, to use the CMDB, to use the change management process, and so on. So, really, that executive buy-in is so key. Right? Because if you don't have that, you're going to struggle to get people to use it, which is going to have that low adoption rate. And you don't want that, right? You want to make sure that it's used. Step 3 is really around designing your CMDB data model. And we talked earlier about the concept of the CSDM. This is where that comes into play. Excuse me, one second. So what we need to do here is we need to make sure that we're only putting data in the CMDB right away that supports our use cases, right? We also want to make sure that we don't boil the ocean and just start to build a comprehensive CMDB right away, right? Just don't turn on discovery and have it start discovering everything in your network, every single device type, every single attribute, right? Think about what you need in there. You want to use out-of-the-box CI classes. You want to try to avoid adding things to the CMDB, because every time you add something new, you have to manage that data. So think carefully about when you're creating attributes or when you're building relationships. You want to make sure that those things are important to manage, because everything that's in there, right, like I said, has to be managed. For example, right, so earlier we talked about the use case of ensuring that our firewall systems are up to date, right, as part of that effort to make sure that people can work seamlessly from home. Right, so in the CMDB, you're going to need things like the firewall devices, maybe the firewall managers, all the servers and applications that support the firewall system, right? And then you also need to pull in the software versions to make sure that they're up to date, as well as any patches, right? And then you also need to have those dependency relationships between them, right? So at a base level, I know there's probably a few more things, but that is what you would need to effectively be able to meet that use case. We're going to pause here and take our next poll, and it's really it's aligned to the CSDM adoption. We want to understand where you are with your CSDM adoption today. So you'll see the poll pop up again, and like I said, if you are using like a web browser, you may not see this. So what is the CSDM? Right, we understand what the CSDM is, but we aren't using it, or we've completed a few models. We've completed some business services modeled and tied to application services. And then the final choice is we have business applications, application services, and business services all created. And we'll give it a few more seconds, and then we'll end the poll. All right, Brenda, you can go ahead and end that. So some of the results that we have here, about 30% of you say, what is the CSDM? Right, so this is something that we are trying to educate our customers on as much as possible. You'll see some resources here at the end that will help you take that training. About 38% of you say we understand it, but we aren't using it yet. Okay, well, this is a great opportunity to get started. We've completed a few models, about 14%. We've completed some business services modeled and tied to application services, 13%. And then at the very end, about 4% of you said that we have business applications, application services, and business services all created. Right, and that makes sense because if we're seeing that you aren't really using it yet, you're not going to be at that high level of maturity down here. So good information, but certainly there's a lot of training that you guys can participate in to get better up to speed on the CSDM. Okay, now that we have our data model created, we want to operationalize the CMDB, right? And this is really around accurately populating the CMDB, managing its health, and creating reports to drive data-driven decisions. So one of the most important things to note here is that if you improperly populate your CMDB, it's going to lead to inaccurate and unreliable data. Some of the things that we don't like are duplicates or misclassified CIs, unclassified or incomplete CIs. And we'll talk more about that as we go throughout. So after I finish, the rest of the day is going to be populating the CMDB topics with Rico, and then Mike is going to help you better understand how to manage health and also report against it. So because if you have inaccurate data, right, that's going to result in poor decision making. People go to create a change request. They may put in the name of a server. Maybe that server, you don't have all the relationships built out yet. So they schedule the change to occur during maybe an operational window that they shouldn't be doing it. Or there could be a conflict with something else that's happening on the same server, right? So if you don't have that data in there correctly, right, it's gonna be, you could cause an outage, you could cause increased risk, right? But you're gonna have rework, right? People are gonna have to go back and fix things that were done in error because of inaccurate data. A recent study by the Institute of Process Excellence found that when work is performed from information that is not clear, concise, and valid, an organization will spend 40% of their resources on that corrective action, or what we call rework, right? So in this case here, having no data is actually better than having bad data. So keep that in mind. All right, the last step, step 5 here, is to create ongoing strategic alignment. So this is essentially where your steering committee has that effective two-way communication with the business stakeholders so that they understand what you're doing as to try and meet their needs, right? But also how you plan to support their future needs. You want to make sure that you tailor your CMDB to align with major projects. We see organizations putting a CMDB team member for every new major project that comes up. For example, if you have a cloud first initiative project, right, a person who has a CMDB role will sit on that project to make sure that the CMDB can support that new effort. As an example, if you're with a cloud first initiative, if you have a need to go cloud first, you're going to need visibility of all those cloud resources in the CMDB, right? So an example decision that the steering committee might make is, well, we need to have a automated discovery capability for cloud resources, right? You don't want to find out last minute that you have to have a solution in place. You want to be better prepared for that new effort coming in. So always understanding where the business is going, tying that back to how can my CMDB or our CMDB support that initiative is really going to help you guys go a long way with making sure that your CMDB continues to drive value for the organization overall. And it's really important to make sure that you don't consider the CMDB as a project. The CMDB is never going to be complete. It's not necessarily that typical go live, right? Because you're always building a CMDB to meet the use cases of the business. Not just use cases, but the strategic initiatives. So as there is a new strategic initiative that pops up, you will define what are the use cases that I need to support that initiative, and you'll iterate, putting the data in the CMDB that you need for that initiative. Perhaps you already have the data in there, great, right? But do you need to enrich that data to further support that initiative, right? So those are the types of things you need to think of, right? The CMDB is not necessarily a product either, right? It's a platform capability, right? If you think about a house, you've got the basement, the foundation, right? The foundation of the house is critical to making sure that the house doesn't fall down, right? Like a weak foundation is going to make the house fall down, or worse, if you're building a tall building, the last thing you need is a weak foundation. So if you're investing in a transformational platform like ServiceNow, you want to make sure that you have a solid foundation, and that is exactly what the CMDB is, right? So it's never really done, right? And it's not just that data model, but it's the relationships that really drive the value, right? Because if you have all these different servers, for example, sitting in the CMDB, and those are not related back to a business service or application, right? What value? Why is that data in the CMDB to begin with, right? So and then why are you investing time and effort to manage that data, right? So if you have those relationships, it's going to be more valuable, right? And the last bullet here, right, is extremely prevalent, right? Perfection is the enemy of progress. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Get the data in there you need for each use case. Continue to iterate, right? So when you think about this chart over here on the right, or this flow, right? Step one, you have all this chaos, right? But then you think, all right, if I just get the servers and networks and software in there, right? Now I've got my inventory. Now I can start to do asset management, and I've got a golden CMDB, right? But that is not the case, right? It's an iterative process, right? So once you have the data in there for each use case, right? You may think that you're in chaos up front, but you're really not. There's no need to panic. Just get the data in there that you need to build out the use cases, for example, asset management. And then you now have a star for that specific use case. Go back, do it again, right? So just make sure that when you're doing this, right, you're documenting it along the way. You're making sure that the right people are involved, right? Of course, but follow the 5 steps, right? Make sure that you are building that healthy CMDB in the right way. And the last thing I'll say here is that those 5 steps are not necessarily, they're not sequential. You could do pieces of those 5 steps all together at the same time, but make sure that you do all the 5 steps to make sure that you have a healthy CMDB. All right, I think that is the last slide that I had. So at this point, I'm going to turn it now over to Rico to talk about CMDB population. Rico, over to you.
Yep, I couldn't get off of mute there. So again, thank you for joining today. I am going to be sharing my screen here in a moment. Give me a second. Let me know when you can see this, please.
I can see it.
All right, sounds good. All right, so what we're going to talk about today for probably the next half hour or so is going to be more from the CMDB population perspective. All right, now keep in mind that it's all about junk in and junk out. There are some of you folks that have mentioned that you have millions and billions of CIs within your CMDB, and that's a fantastic thing, depending on whether that data and information is being managed or not. As Steve had mentioned earlier, it's going to be important from a governance perspective is to make sure that the data is being managed. There is a use case behind having that data within the CMDB and so forth and so on. But the thing is that we want to be able to understand how we can populate that CMDB as well. So one of the things that's going to be important to understand, and we need to make sure we set the groundwork for the data in the CMDB, is what is the difference between an asset and a CI? All right, now there are definitely some differences. There's definitely some overlapping, and we're going to talk a little bit around that. So let's take a look at real quickly what a configuration item is, or what a CI. So when I say CI, it's going to be configuration item. So it's any component that needs to be managed in order to deliver some sort of support to a service. All right, so things that normally are going to be discoverable and so forth is more of an asset. But in this case here, it's going to be anything within the infrastructure. So, you know, within your CMDB, obviously an application is a CI. Anything that's part of the infrastructure or a service to the business is going to be a CI. So we have a series of lists here based on that. You know, hardware, software, applications, databases, even database instances. And some of these specific attributes can be CIs as well. All right, so just keep that in mind. So when we start talking about the differences between an asset and a CI, obviously there is going to be a specific nomenclature for every single company and business that you maybe work with. An asset is something that has a beginning, middle, and an end. It has some sort of intrinsic value to that person, that group, or the enterprise itself. And again, a configuration item is any component that needs to be managed in order to deliver or support a service. Now, as I just mentioned, from a configuration item perspective, that can have some sort of meaning into an asset as well. But like I mentioned, there is definitely going to be some overlap, and we are going to be talking about that as well. But one of the mission critical things that's going to be important, especially from a CMDB perspective, is that the CMDB has relationships as well. One of the questions I got earlier was more from an application performance monitoring perspective. There's a lot of technologies for monitoring systems and network devices and so forth and so on. The help of having relationships is that you can understand business analysis and business impact based on relationships. So down the road, as you mature further into CMDB and you start getting further into the event management space, keep in mind is that we're able to bring in those events, and because of those relationships between CIs, you're able to provide additional content such as business impact back to the business. That's something that a configuration item and the CMDB can do, but from just an asset perspective, there is no relationship. Right? So again, an asset is very often going to be a CI, probably close to 99.99% of the time, it is going to be a CI, and CIs are not necessarily assets as well. And we will get into a bit of that, or some examples around that. So looking at that overlap, as we talked about it before, some of the things that we are focusing in on that are really related or have some sort of overlap is going to be from what is discoverable. All right, some of the servers, some of the routers, switches, network devices, storage environments, and so forth. They're definitely assets. They have a life cycle, but they're also configuration items because they're managed type of devices within our environment. Some of the things that are assets that are not a CI is going to be like, let's say, a license, a software license. All right, they are based on entitlements, they're based on contracts and so forth. And so it's definitely an asset, but is not really a configuration item. Or you don't configure licenses in any way. All right, so they are managed from an asset management perspective, but not from a CMDB perspective. But then looking at it from a configuration item side of things, websites, you know, your URLs into your environment, for instance, you know, that they are definitely configuration items. It's an application service or a business service or a transaction, you know, URL into a service. They are configuration items. They can be monitored. They can be discovered as well, but they're not really an asset. All right, so it's something where, you know, it doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end and so forth for a specific website. All right, so technically. So again, showing you that assets definitely have some sort of financial value, and CIs often deliver that financial value, but, you know, not all the time. So So just keep that in mind. So what differs throughout a lot of the various different organizations is really going to be based on that overlap, which is going to be your servers, routers, and anything that's going to be discoverable to be focused around a configuration item as well as an asset in your environment. So looking at it from an asset perspective, again, this can be really focused around any asset, whether that will be a software asset or a hardware asset. It has a start from a request perspective, all right? So again, it goes into the whole financial aspect life cycle around an asset. Looking at the procurement processes, resources. With that, there's going to be a request. There can be a procurement phase for that device per se, and then you receive that device. At that point in time is really when that device gets a serial number, for instance, or some sort of asset tag number, in which it gets thrown into the CMDB. All right, in that case, you start having a lot of support capabilities. Who's going to be assigned to this CI? Again, that's definitely a field within that record. How is it going to be monitored? And there's going to be a change process around this specific asset. There's a deployment or an execution of that specific device in your environment. And all of this type of stuff is really functions of the CMDB. Hence, now that asset, still an asset, is going to become a CI within that CMDB. So now it gets thrown into service, for instance. And then once we dispose of it, again, that CI can typically, or theoretically, still be within the CMDB, but now it's going to be in retired mode or non-operational and so forth. So it will not impact say SLAs. It would not impact orphan type of parameters within your CMDB health dashboard, which we'll get into down the road here today. But again, keep in mind is that this just gives you a good idea based around the life cycle of an asset with respect to when it actually becomes a CI within a CMDB and the specific governance model around that CI when it is there. And then once you dispose or retire that device, then now it actually is in a different phase of within its life cycle. Right. So again, as we talked about from an identification and reconciliation side, this is just a process that we'll get into a bit more, understanding how that data is actually imported into the CMDB, as well as we have many different mechanisms and how data is actually populating the CMDB, and which is going to be the next step of what our discussion is going to be about. All right. So population methods can be vast and wide. All right. So CI or CMDB aggregates all the information about all your IT resources, and that is called pretty much your CIs. So from all of the various providers into one single rationalized source of truth, to that it really is focused around what is being stored within that CMDB. All the data and information, you sort of want to populate it from a near or real-time perspective. You have a lot of technologies today. It is very, very critical to have some sort of common identification process for all of those devices or CIs within your environment. You want to be able to have your CMDB be your central and single system of record for all of your IT technical resources. All right. So when you have I'm sorry,
Rico, sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to interject something really quickly since we're getting a lot of questions around kind of the difference between assets and CIs.
Sure,
and
absolutely.
At least for me, the quickest and easiest way to sort of differentiate and remember the difference between an asset and a CI is that an asset intrinsically has value, right? If you fell on hard times, you could go out and sell it on the black market in some way, right? But a CI provides value to the organization, right? By fulfilling some capability or doing something like that. So assets have value, CIs provide value.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, and it's operational. So the CI is what you would relate to a record in ServiceNow, like an incident or problem or a change, right? The asset is something that you're managing kind of behind the scenes.
Yep. Perfect. Thanks, guys. No, it's a good point. So, I mean, but again, just keep in mind is that that diagram that I showed there in the last is going to be focused around again, that there's definitely overlapping as well. Even though that there's value in a CI, it could be an asset. You can have also a CI that is not an asset, but still have value as well. So just keep that in mind. So when you have multiple import sources referring to the same IT resource, and this is really focused around having these multiple sources of data, again, from application performance monitored technologies, from utilizing our discovery and service mapping capability. There's also importing data from cloud environments, API cloud resources, event sources, as well as if you have developed DevOps stories within your environment. Again, these are just all sources of data and information. And when you start bringing in multiple sources into one IT environment, you need to definitely address the different aspects of that individual resource, but sometimes they provide different value for the same specific attribute. The second responsibility, one of the main responsibilities of the CMDB is going to be what we call the IRE, which we'll get into more detail. The IRE stands for Identification and Reconciliation Engine. All right, it is the engine that all the data needs to run through in order for it to populate the CMDB with the correct stuff that you are interested in. As we talked about with the many different sources that is populating the CMDB, there is a technology that you may have that you rely on most to have the most accurate data, the most trustworthy types of information. And so it needs to run through that to identify the correct device in its correct fashion, whether that would be a serial number or a SysID or a MAC address or whatever that may be. And so if we deem that, hey, SolarWinds or maybe our discovery has that data and we rely on that information, then that discovery source that has authoritative capability to populate the CMDB is our discovery. If we deem that SolarWinds has the authority to create the host name because we rely on that data, then you can do just that. And that's what the IRE does. All right, and it actually makes sure that we identify the CI correctly based on its uniqueness. At the same time, we need to determine whether that is a duplicate or not, and so be able to populate it with the correct data and information. All right, so the IRE really is a blend of the best of all the sources of inputs to produce an up-to-date and comprehensive view of your entire IT estate. But keep in mind is when I say your entire IT estate, don't go out and start boiling the ocean. This is one of the things that Steve talked about earlier on why CMDBs fail. If you're at the beginning stages of populating your CMDB, don't boil the ocean by all means. Focus on the critical few as opposed to the trivial many. And so making sure that you are providing value back to your business right from the get-go. And make sure that the data that's populating your CMDB is managed by something and there is a use case behind it and there's a goal associated with populating that your CMDB. All right. So, we covered, why you need it and now let's talk about how you create that data. All right, so today, obviously, and this is going to be more of a shameless type of plugin, but ServiceNow has its own specific capabilities. Some of you customers already utilize some of these technologies from a discovery and CMDB population perspective. We do have ServiceNow's discovery and ServiceNow capability to help you in the near real-time discovery of devices within your environment, both from a data center side of things, whether that will be specific hard rack mounted type systems, specifically, virtualized type of environments, understanding what is out there within your environment and populating the CMDB with specific data. The nice thing about using our discovery is that it is a native application to our platform. Everything that we talk about within our ServiceNow environment is based around the platform, and discovery and service mapping are platform-based capabilities. As for the data center, it also is able to capture devices and information from a public and private cloud perspective. So providing that you have the correct credentials and authoritative capabilities, you can still populate your CMDB with that data. There's also a BYOD, all right? You bring your own data to the party per se. So in this case here, there are a lot of investments that you have already made. I'll get into more detail here in a bit, but there is a capability to have your own information. We have a lot of customers that do import of data and information from either spreadsheets or from other technologies that you may be utilizing. By all means, use that capability. But keep in mind is that there's got to be some sort of governance behind that data, and there's got to be approval processes in place to make sure that that data is accurately populating that CMDB. Right. So today, from a discovery perspective, we have an agentless capability. All right, agentless meaning that we utilize what we call a mid server within your environment that is a conduit to the ServiceNow platform. All right, so what happens is that there is a constant communication from the mid server to the platform to indicate, hey, do you want me to discover something within my environment? All right, so there's a one-way conversation, secured conversation back to the mid server. The mid server says, yeah, or the ServiceNow platform says, I need something for you to do. I need you to go out and discover an environment. And so it tells the mid server, discover this environment. The mid server goes out and starts discovering stuff in your environment. All right. So as it pings for data and information and attributes and so forth, it collects the data and sends the information back to the ServiceNow instance. So from a continuous fashion or from a scheduled perspective, you're able to look at all the data and information or what is being discovered within your environment, utilizing that mid server within your environment. All right. It's the same type of capability for a cloud environment also. So if you are starting to move a lot of your applications, a lot of your business functions out into the cloud, by all means, we have the capability to discover that as well. So cloud technologies, as well as we talked about earlier, both from a public and private perspective, providing ability to go out and understand, hey, these are my providers, these are my subscriptions that I currently have. Private clouds from these very different types of technologies, also understanding and discovering containers and PaaS providers for your for your specific CMDB building initiatives as well. But keep in mind is that there are, and there always will be, out of band type of capabilities as well. There's a lot of capabilities out there, a lot of technologies that maybe we just don't have support for, but we have partners and we have customers that are consistently working on providing capabilities to discover that. And so we have embedded some of that within our capability as well. All right, so keep in mind is that if you want to run out to the ServiceNow App Store, the App Store provides a lot of content of specific things that are, of course, supported, but also things that are not supported, but we have capabilities to help bring in that data into the CMDB as well. All right. All right. So of course, there's no use having visibility of the information, from a days or weeks or even out of date, especially since change in the cloud is measured in hours, minutes, or even seconds. If the data isn't up to date, accurate, and complete, it means that your people, your folks, your teammates will make the wrong decisions. And once they are burned, they'll no longer trust or use that CMDB. So you want to make sure that the resources and information is up to date. The problem with traditional discovery tools is that they can't keep up with the cloud. We know that cloud as well as VM environments change on an ongoing basis, usually every hour, every 30 minutes and so forth. So they periodically pull for changes, which means that you have to wait for the next scheduled pass to find out what has changed. And that same thing goes for our discovery. It's based on schedules. So if the schedule kicks off once a day, we're going to look at that change once a day. But if changes happen every hour, you're definitely going to miss some things. So we have direct integrations into our real-time discovery for these cloud types of environments. So ServiceNow Discovery, on the other hand, is built for specifically the cloud. It triggers targeted discovery automatically when it receives some sort of change event. And so, from the cloud interfaces such as like AWS config or even Azure monitor, this gives you near-time, real-time visibility into that type of environment. It also provides support for both your IaaS or even PaaS infrastructure, as well as container and serverless technologies, such as Kubernetes, Docker, AWS Lambda. And you can easily extend these out-of-the-box capabilities to support additional cloud technologies and other vendors as well. So by getting value from your CMDB starts with the data quality. As we talked about earlier, it's all about junk in, junk out, right? And so we have various different types of capabilities to bring in data and information, but we also actually embedded some capabilities within our service graph connectors. All right, this helps answer some of these questions. How do I leverage CIs from Qualys, which is our vulnerability type of capabilities, to supplement the CMDB? Or I'm concerned about creating duplicate CIs when bringing in my SolarWinds data. What do I really do? And so we've extended the capability of bringing in data and information. Our discovery does a fantastic job when it brings in information from these capabilities. But keep in mind, it's not going to bring in everything. It's going to bring stuff that's going to be pertinent to populating specific fields within the CMDB. So Service Graph Connectors provides the capability to bring in additional data and information from these other technologies. So again, with this data and information, helps you improve experience as well as the time to value for your CMDB and providing value back to your business. It also maintains your trust in your system of record. Hence, hey, there's specific things, specific vulnerability type of information we need to bring in from Qualys that Discovery doesn't provide. So we trust the data that Qualys really has. So let's utilize Service Graph Connectors to bring in the data that we need. But at the same time, also we want to reduce that risk. Obviously, any technology that goes out and does discovery, there's always some sort of risk involved. It just happens with any technology. But with the Service Graph Connectors, helps you reduce that risk by providing the right data from the right source. Okay. All right. So enhancing your CMDB, we talked about earlier about the IRE. All right, the Identification and Reconciliation Engine. It is an API that's built on your CMDB, not a skewable item, not a chargeable item. It's something that comes with your CMDB already. Anything that is discovered is actually that populates your CMDB. It goes in because it's a native application. It already runs all data and information through that IRE. Identifies that CI by its correct capability, whether that would be your serial number or that would be your host name or whatever that is. And it creates a new CI and inserts it into what we call the reconciliation engine. The reconciliation engine determines what data needs to populate what field with what information, and before it actually gets thrown into the CMDB. So if we are also bringing in data from a finance perspective, or if we are importing assets or other database type of information or whatever, all that information and all the technologies that do get brought in still needs to run through the identification engine, or the IRE. All right, this helps us to make sure that we have the right data the first time before we populate the CMDB. The last thing we want to do is rework, which what Steve mentioned earlier. Reworking costs money, it takes time, and it's just a waste of a CMDB, honestly. So do it the right time the first time. Another view from that perspective is bringing in from these multiple data sources. As we talked about earlier, ServiceNow Discovery is one source that runs through identification and reconciliation, but also third-party sources as well. So again, whether that will be importing Nagios or SolarWinds data, or SCCM data and information, or import sets based on what you've already created, maybe spreadsheets or what have you. Make sure that the IRE API is involved so that it runs it through its API layer before it gets populated into that CMDB.
Hey, I wanted to jump in again really quickly, Rico, since we're getting a lot of questions around the service graph connectors and whether or not they're a separate license above and beyond visibility, or if there's a separate capability. So I, I want to just clarify really structurally Service Graph is not really a product. It's just a new architectural direction that we are moving the way that we do third-party connections and data ingestion into the platform. It is not an additional cost. However, you do have to be on one of the newer ITOM visibility SKUs that are subscription unit based, as opposed to the older node based licenses, because that's the newer architectural direction, and that's the way that we're moving the platform.
Right. And the Service Graph connectors has not just been developed by ServiceNow. It's actually developed by both partners as well as ServiceNow for a lot of those popular third-party data sources. And this helps to improve the health of your CMDB and support, definitely your customer or your outcomes. All right, so that's a good point. Thanks, Mike. All right. One of the things that's going to be definitely important, especially from a CI perspective, is how we identify specific CIs. All right, there are various different mechanisms to identify that, and what we normally do is be able to identify by how that CI is unique to your environment. We have already created various identifier entries for a lot of things, especially from the hardware perspective. All right, computers and servers and databases and so forth, we've created identifiers already for you based on how and what the industry is doing today from an identification perspective. Today, we identify a lot of things by serial number or serial number type, as well as by host name or even IP address and MAC address. They could be unique identifiers. So that's just going to be one of the key components which we will walk through from a lab perspective. So we are going to walk through specific labs around identification rules and so forth. We want to also make sure that we define good identifiers. All right, understand what guarantees uniqueness of that CI, especially when you don't want to create duplications in a virtual world. Our virtual machines, virtual desktops can be a challenge, but the great thing about our ServiceNow platform is that we have direct integrations into, let's say, vCenter. So if something changes, vMotion kicks in and starts moving things around, it's automatically going to populate and update the CMDB with the correct data and information. So it's just one of the capabilities that we currently have. But keep in mind is that anything that happens within your CMDB, there's got to be governance and data owners for everything and anything that happens. It just makes sense. It actually provides a good good step into making sure that the data in there is correct. You want to identify these rules before you start any discovery, because if you start discovering without any rules, then you're just going to populate with a bunch of stuff, and then you're going to have to go ahead and revamp a lot of that stuff later on. All the owners of that data information have to agree with what is being populated. The tools must be able to provide all the data that is populating, all the information that you're looking for. And then, what do you do if you have missing data? You want to make sure that your discovery capability, your discovery logs are being monitored as well. So you don't just have a sysadmin for your CMD or for your ServiceNow platform. You also have a CMDB admin as well to make sure that the rules are set correctly. The approval processes are there. The data streams are going to be effective, but also understand whether data is missing or required or recommended, which Mike will talk to later. So this is something that's going to be important, as well as everything that gets populated with CMDB is part of a specific class. So if you're identifying a server, that server is a Windows server, it's going to be under the server class, under the Windows server class. All right, and we'll get into that here in a second. Everything that gets discovered is going to get thrown into some sort of class. This is our mad way to categorize everything within your CMDB. All right, so everything that is a CI gets thrown into a configuration item class. And that table is going to be CMDB underscore CI, right? Makes sense. CMDB underscore configuration item. So when we start discovering or importing data or whatever that is, it runs it through its IRE for us to determine what it really is, right? Based on identification rules. We see, let's say, for instance, a Windows server. All right, so Windows server comes in. We're going to say, okay, it's a Windows server. So it definitely gets thrown into a hardware class because obviously it's a hardware. It is running some sort of OS. It has maybe specific attributes or whatever that is. So it's definitely going to get thrown into a computer class as well as a server class. So now we have a hierarchy to our madness as well. So our Windows server is under the server class, under the computer class, hardware, as well as configuration item. But it is a Windows server. So will it get thrown into the Linux server class? Absolutely not. We have a Windows server class, so it will not get thrown into the Linux server class. So just keep that in mind, is that when we start talking through the CI class manager within our labs, that there is a method to this specific madness for how we categorize data and how we display that within the CMDB. Right? We want to create a service-aware CMDB. This is going to be very, very important. The capability that we talked about earlier from a horizontal discovery is very typical. All right, there's a lot of technologies out there that populate their databases, for instance, with information. All right, and this is really based around, doing what we call a horizontal discovery. Go out and discover just a bunch of stuff. Right, identify all my load balancers, identify all my Windows servers, applications, my VM environment, whatever that is, and populate it with stuff. All right, and as well as its attributes. Now, that's not really a service-aware CMDB because we really don't understand services. We just understand infrastructure at that point. So going forward, we also have the capability to do top-down discovery. So we utilize what we call our service mapping so that we use what has been discovered with our CIs, individual CIs and devices, to help build upon the relationships so that we create a more service-aware CMDB, understanding, hey, this is your email service or a payroll service or e-commerce service based on relationships and dependencies of a specific conversation. All right, and I'll get into more detail here in a bit. So detail and CI information from all your IT assets, capture real-time data and information based on business impact or whatever that may be, especially from the cloud environment, discovering load balancers as well as their clusters, and building these clusters within your CMDB is going to be important. And so now we create a tight service-centric context to all of your CIs within your CMDB. Right. So from a horizontal perspective, obviously we talked about it. There's a lot of discovery tools out there that do a great job when it goes out and discovers whatever you have. And this is just that, goes out, discovers whatever it may be. But at the same time, we're also looking at it from a relationship perspective. Within our discovery capability, we have what's called ADM, Application Dependency Mapping, which goes out and discovers who or whom you are communicating with based on, let's say, web server, app servers, or databases based on TTPs, open TCP connections or open UDP connections. So it's giving you a view based on these are all the connections that a server may have. So now building on relationships into your CMDB, not just your CI specifically. So what we do now is that we have what's called application service mapping. So based on an entry point, and when I say entry point, this can mean an executable, or it could be some sort of task or something that maybe an end user would perform to get their job done. For instance, in the medical industry, I know Steve talked about this earlier, where you have an application called Epic and you want to do a patient lookup. Well, what does the end user need to do for a patient lookup, right? Do you need to type in the patient or social security number or whatever that may be? They hit enter and it goes out and hits a cluster of our load balancer, hits a cluster of web servers, databases, app servers, VM environment, whatever that is. And so we're going to follow that through its multiple tiers and to determine who it may be communicating with next, identifying the app and so forth. So now it's building out a map based on that conversation, based on that entry point. All right. Now the entry point can be many different things. When I say entry point, it could be a URL access into some sort of application. It also could be a JDBZ connection for a database conversation or an MQ call for MQ series or what have you. So it could be about 70 or 80 different types of ways we communicate based on your application needs. So keep that in mind. So not just from a discovery phase, from a bottom-up discovery, but also from a top-down discovery as well to help us provide context to all the CIs within your CMDB. So with that, now we have business context, adding your individual devices and building out a map based on impact for your use later on. So now it's service aware. One of the things that we have actually instilled within our service mapping capability is tag-based discovery. Why did we do this? Well, it's because a lot of the applications that are now being built and pushed out into the cloud environment are tag-based. And so we would love to be able to utilize the user-defined tags to help discover that environment. And so with our tag-based discovery, we can do just that. So adding on specific tags to look for from a cloud service, be able to build that top-down discovery in a cloud environment far quicker and far easier, and to build those maps out. So that giving you a bit more value quicker, and understanding changes as well that happen in your cloud environment. All right. So let's talk a little bit from an integration standpoint. So what we've also instilled within our CMDB is what we call the robust transform engine. It's new, which is an out-of-the-box mechanism to transfer data into the CMDB. This is leveraged by what we call the Integration Hub ETL, and I'll get into the ETL here in a minute in the next slide. But it's more focused around being able to seamlessly integrate data into that CMDB. Unlike the service graph connectors, which I talked about earlier, service graph connectors are connectors built around specific technologies to make sure that we're populating it with the right data. But there's technologies out there, third-party sources, that we want to add additional content for, building a lot of the metadata, using that metadata rules to run it through our robust transform engine to help before it actually runs into the IRE, before it populates the CMDB. Hopefully I'm not confusing the heck out of everybody, but it's just another mechanism and the way we do things under the covers for these more complex type of environments to populate the CMDB. So this helps to improve CMDB data quality tremendously. But again, it's something that is embedded within your CMDB as well. So just keep that in mind. This is it's actually a good mechanism and a good way, as we talked about, to bring the data into your CMDB. But there's also let's say a quick setup guide to do just that. So if we have a technology in place today that is something that we really don't understand, how is the data, what's the data look like, what's the data source look like, how do we actually prepare the data for mapping and so forth. So we have a walkthrough, a guided setup per se, to integrate the data into, from your sources into the CMDB. So keep in mind is that we have a whole learning process behind that as well. So by all means, we have a free course to help you understand more of the data transformation side of things for our Integration Hub ETL. All right. So at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we are identifying things correctly. We want to be able to automate a lot of the newly discovered CIs into the CMDB. But keep in mind is there's just got to be a specific support group for anything that's populating your CMDB as well. If the support does not exist, if there's no use case for CIs to be discovered and populate the CMDB, don't put it in there. It's just going to be there, sitting there with no one managing it. So keep in mind is that there needs to be a support group for anything. By all means, utilize our discovery and service mapping capability. Again, they are native applications to our platform, and they are supported processes currently within our platform as well. They automatically keep things current and up to date, and they avoid a lot of tech debt as well. So, going out and purchasing additional technologies and so forth, a lot of companies definitely do that, but our discovery can help with minimizing a lot of that tech debt. If you are a legacy or have a legacy CMDB or spreadsheets and so forth, you definitely have to make the right decisions and tough decisions, whether that data still needs to be within the CMDB or not. If so, how are we going to import it? And if we don't want to do import, what technologies are we going to use to populate that CMDB? All right, so this is definitely important information, important decisions that need to be made, not just by the sysadmin, but specifically the CMDB admin as well. You got to identify reconciliation strategies. So who has authoritative capability to populate that CMDB, which technologies is the source of truth, and then leverage your automated reconciliation as well. Make sure that anything that gets brought in and populates your CMDB has one, governance behind it, but do it from an automated perspective. You don't want to go back and rework your CMDB and readjust it just to make it healthy again. All right. So if we can continue, then let's go in and start working on our labs. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be sharing my screen for our lab environment, for my environment, and then I'm going to be walking through lab 1, 2, 3, and 4. If there's any questions, by all means, our gurus will still be online, but they're pretty basic and they're pretty simple to walk through. What we want to do is make sure that you have the gist of how to create specific rules around identification, reconciliation, data precedence, and so forth. So let's take this quick minute to make sure that everyone has a lab guide. There is a couple scripts that will need to be copy and pasted so that we can create data. Some of you may not have the capability to copy a script from that link or from that lab guide. By all means, download that lab guide. That way you have a hard copy on your screen and then be able to copy and paste it that way. This lab guide is actually a great tool so that if you don't have the time to run through these labs today, by all means, you can utilize it in your dev environment. So it's a great way good thing to reference later on. So just keep that in mind. So let's do just that. I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to share my instance. All right, so right now you should see my environment. So one of the things that we want to get familiarized right from the get-go is going to be the CI class manager. As we talked about, the madness to all of our CIs is going to be our class manager. It's got to be organized in some way. So if you folks want to dive in and just type in, CI at the top filter navigator, top left-hand side, class. Class, obviously something's going to come up that says class manager. You want to click on class manager and this screen populates. All right. You want to click on the very top button that says hierarchy, and a little pop-up is gonna push out, and it's going to have all of your classes. As we talked about earlier, everything is going to be part of a specific class. Anything from a configuration files, from database catalogs, and anything, especially from a hardware perspective, gets thrown in here. The little brackets for the numbers indicates that there are that many CIs within that category. All right, so just a good view to understand what you have in each one of these specific classes. Starting on lab 1, what we are going to do is we are going to just understand what CI identification really is, especially creating rules. So if I go in and type in IP phones, then if I click on IP phones, it's going to automatically sort to IP phones. And so we have IP phones here, and we're going to select that class. That class is going to have a wealth of information, especially from a basic info perspective. Again, it's going to be the display name. You can add a description and the table that it's related to. As I mentioned before, every class, every CI is part of a specific table. And if you down the road become a CMDB expert and you want to create a query against that, which Mike will talk about it later. This is going to be the table that all of the IP phones are going to be a resident part of. All of the attributes that are going to be associated with that CI as well. So obviously we want to make sure that there's an assigned group, maybe specific things. There's about 76 or so, and on your own time, by all means, you can navigate through those. What we're going to be focusing in on are going to be identification rules. Today, within our IP phones, there isn't anything that is going to be there. So we are going to do just that. So let's create our first identification rule. We're going to go in and click the little plus sign for add. Right, and we are going to make sure that this IP phone rule is going to be independent. Independent meaning that this IP phone is not going to be dependent on anything else, such as a server or anything else. So we're just going to say we're just going to do a clean independent CI. Anything that populates the CMDB that's going to be IP phone based is going to be an independent device. Select that to active and click on save. So now we've created an identification rule based on an independent IP phone, and then we can move on from that. So now at this time, what we want to do is we want to create a rule or an entry to determine how we are going to identify an IP phone. All right, so in this case here, I'm going to click on add for identifier entries. And I am going to say that I want you to use all the attributes in just the table of the IP phone. Remember how we see that I clicked on all attributes or all the attributes for that CI? Well, I want to include all of those attributes. I don't want to use attributes from another table. I don't want to use attributes from our main table or any other table, meaning that it's hybrid. So it's going to be just for IP phones and it's specific attributes, and click on next. All right, so with that, how am I going to identify IP phones? What's going to be the uniqueness for the IP phones? So what I'm going to do is I am just going to go to model. I can type in model right there and click on model number and just bring that over for selected. And then I'm going to select serial number. All right, so now I have all of the available attributes, and what it's going to identify an IP phone is going to be the model number and the serial number. All right, and make sure it's selected to active and click on save. So now the loaded identifier is going to be model number, serial number, for this IP phone rule. So because we don't have any data for IP phones, we don't have any CIs, we are going to create one. So within your lab guide under step 9, there is going to be a script there. If you want, go ahead and copy that script. Go back to your instance. On the top left-hand side under your filter navigator, just type in background. I can spell, and then something will come up saying scripts background. Under that, I'm going to copy and paste that script directly into that field or that canvas per se. So what we're going to do with this script is that within this CMDB table, which is the CI underscore IP phone, I'm going to create a user, or not a user, a host name of IP phone number 1 with a serial number of 1234, a model number of 1234, with an input source or discovery source of ServiceNow. So we're actually manipulating our platform here by just manually creating a CI as opposed to going out and discovery. So this is actually a fantastic script. So if you want to create some test data, you can just run this. You can add additional attributes as well. So the list of attributes that we have, you can add additional attributes if you want to play around with it more on your own time, by all means. And we can click on run script. So it just gives us some good information based on, hey, we inserted, this row and so forth and so on. So you can read through that. So at this time, what we want to see is the data that was created. So go ahead and jump back to that filter navigator there on the top left-hand side, and we're going to jump directly to that table. All right. So I'm going to type in CMDB underscore CI underscore IP underscore phone dot capital LIST. All right. So when I type in capital .list, it's going to open up a new tab with the list of CIs under that table. If I do a lower class LIST, it's going to open up within just this window here itself. All right. So, but because I don't want to leave this view here, I want to do a capital LIST, hit enter, a new tab opens up and it says it cannot find it. Oh, I spelled CMDB wrong. That's convenient. CMDB underscore CI underscore IP underscore phone dot LIST. There we go. So now we have an IP phone that we created. I'm going to hit the little gearbox on the top left hand. I'm going to include model number. I'm going to include serial number. And I'm going to include source. You don't have to, but I'm going to, or updated by. I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm going to grab the model number, serial number. I'm going to bring this closer to the top and hit OK. So now I have IP phone 1, manufacturer, obviously don't have anything, model number 1234, serial number 1234. All right. So now, because we created that CMDB or that CI, it ran it through the identification reconciliation engine. Identification rule indicated to look for model number, serial number as a unique IP address, or not as a unique identifier for that IP, and populate the CMDB with that CI under IP phone. All right. So this is the data and information. All right. I'm going to give you folks probably about a minute to complete the lab, and then we'll move forward with lab number 2.
And Rico, while we're waiting, I just wanted to mention to everybody that these instances will be available until around noon Eastern time tomorrow. So whatever you don't finish here on the workshop, you could certainly do on your own as well.
Great, thanks, Steve. All right, so let's move forward. I know the first lab is pretty simple. All right, so it's just creating identifiers, it's creating an identification rule, and just creating a new CI. So now let's quickly understand what reconciliation really is. As we talked about before, we want to make sure that we're populating the correct CI with the correct data, all the time. This would involve making sure that we have correct data sources as well with the correct information. So what we're going to do is jump back to our instance, and we are going to go back to our CI class manager. In my instance, I've created a favorite, and my favorite is going to be my CI class manager. So I'm going to go back to my class manager. As it populates, I'm going to jump back to my hierarchy for all my CI classes, and I'm going to type in computer. And computer is going to be the CI class that I'm going to be focusing in on for this next couple labs. As soon as it completes, I'm going to type in computer. And I'm not going to select computer room, computer AC, or any of that type of stuff, just computer at its highest class. And I'm going to select computer as well. So now, again, we have the basic information for that CI class, as well as the table that it's associated with, and so forth. And I'm going to go down to reconciliation rules. This is where you would create your rules based on data sources that are coming in to run through reconciliations rules through, as well as data precedence rules and so forth and so on. So let's create a reconciliation rule. I'm going to click on the plus here. And we are going to have two data sources within our lab environment. Our first data source is going to be MS, SMS, and the next one's going to be ServiceNow Discovery. All right, so let's create those. The first one is going to be MS, SMS. Make sure that's set to active. I'm going to click next. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to state that I want you to run reconciliations for any CIs that do come in within the CMDB that have an IP address and a serial number that are going to be, of course, focused around our computer CI class. So I'm going to select IP address because this is going to be my sources for data. Is that SMS is going to have the data for IP address as well as serial number. All right. And I'm going to select next. And then I can add filter conditions as well. So keep in mind is that I'm not going to use it today, but if I want to select SMS for just Linux servers or just for a specific CI class, then I can do that here. But in this case here, that it's going to be based on anything that's created under the computer class. All IP and serial numbers are going to be part of the SMS import capability. So now we have one data source. So now let's create another data source, and it's going to be ServiceNow Discovery. I'm going to select the plus add, and I'm going to select ServiceNow. Make sure it's set to active and click on next. Now, in this case here, I'm not going to select a specific attribute. I'm going to select apply to all attributes. All right, this means that everything else that gets brought in through ServiceNow Discovery is going to populate all of the other remaining CIs or attributes. So I'm going to click next. I'm not going to add any filter conditions against this and click on save. So now I have these two data sources. So now what we need to do is we need to determine the source or the precedence. So I'm going to give you another 30 seconds or so to complete this lab number 2, and then we'll move forward. But it's pretty simple. Just for everybody's information, again, in case you joined late, all the data and information that you do see here, the lab guides, well, lab guides is available, but your lab instances will be available until about, what was that, Steve, tomorrow sometime?
Correct. They will have these instances that they will be available until tomorrow around noon Eastern time.
Okay.
For you to finish.
Perfect. And the lab guides actually is a good tool to walk through some of the configuration capabilities as well. So by all means, you can keep that and utilize it for your creation pleasure, I guess, for your rules.
Yeah. Just actually one more thing, Rico. So we're going to be, we're planning to take a break after we finish labs 1 through 4. There will be time allotted during that break as well for you to, complete some of these labs.
Perfect. All right, so continue on with lab number 3, reconciliation precedence. So now that we have our two data sources, this really doesn't say which technology has precedence over writing which fields or which attributes. So let's create data precedence rules. So go ahead and click the plus add, and we're going to select our first data source, which is going to be MS or SMS. Make sure it's active and click on save. And if I click on add again, and I'm going to select ServiceNow, and I'm going to set priority to 200 for this one. Keep in mind is that our priority categorization within our platform, if you remember, it's a little backwards, honestly. So the lower the number, the higher priority it has. All right, so 100 obviously has a higher priority than a 200. All right, so this is telling me is that if we have SMS data that comes in, the priority to write over IP and serial number is for MS SMS. Anything else that comes in is going to have priority 200, which means that if we have IP address as well as serial number comes in, it will not overwrite IP address and serial number because it does not have precedence. All right, so let's create some test data around that. And that is going to be part of lab number 4. So I'm going to give you 15 seconds to probably get this ready to get these 2 rules up and running. And we should be ready with that.
Rico, I just also wanted to add something else. I know there's been a lot of questions around what is MS-SMS. MS-SMS is the legacy name for SCCM. So if you're familiar with the Microsoft SCCM or System Center Configuration Manager, SMS is the legacy name. We just haven't updated the source name in ServiceNow. You will see with the Service Graph connectors, though, that it does have SCCM in the name.
No, thanks for clarifying that, Steve. All right, so by default within your CMDB, all the CIs have a data refresh rule of a default of 60 days. In this case here, we are going to set a data refresh rule for specifically the computer CI class. So if I go ahead and go to data refresh rules and click on add, I'm going to set all data and information for SMS for 14 days. So what this is telling me is that after 14 days, if SMS does not populate the IP address or update it, because it's going to have an update date every time it updates the CMDB or that CI within 14 days, then it's going to either give you a stale CI or it will overwrite that data with that ServiceNow information. So now I'm going to go back to my script, my background script, which I created a shortcut for as well. And within your lab guide, there's another data creation script. I'm going to copy. I'm going to paste that here. So now I'm going to create data within my computer CI class. The host name is going to be computer1 with a serial number of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And the IP address of .14, and the data source is going to be ServiceNow. So because this data source is ServiceNow, and it has the capability to populate all CIs, then we are going to create a CI with pretty much all of the attributes. So I'm going to run that script. All right. So now, again, I can go back up to my filter navigator and dive directly into the list of CIs that we've created. So I'm going to type in CMDB_CI_computer.list. Computer, there you go. All right, so now I have all of these CIs or all of these computers that have been created. But I'm going to click on the customize list and I'm going to include IP address. I'm going to include serial number. I'm going to include discovery source as well as updated. So I want to date and when this data was updated. I'm going to select those 4, bring those up to the top a bit, and click OK. All right, so now I have those IP address, serial numbers, data source, and updated. I'm going to sort under updated. And this is the box that actually was just updated via that script. So we have computer 1, we have IP address, serial number, and discovery source, which was just updated. Okay, so let's go forward and we are going to go back to my script. So if I jump back to my instance where we have this script history, I can just hit the back button. It's going to bring up that canvas with the script you just entered in. And I'm going to change this to computer 2. All right, and I'm going to change the IP address to 15, as well as the data source is going to be changed to MS-SMS. All right, So now we have a new host name, we have a new IP address, and we have a new data source. And I'm going to hit run script. We can see that it was inserted, as well as there was an update to a specific CI in that class. I can jump back to my list view, and I can right click anywhere in this gray area and click on refresh list. So now we still have the computer name, that host name. We have an IP address that was changed. The serial number stays the same, but the discovery source is now SMS. So why is it that the SMS did not populate it with the new host name, but did change the data source and the IP address? It is because, based on our reconciliation rule, means that SMS has precedence to populate the IP address and the serial number only, all right, not the host name. That is the ServiceNow, all right, discovery source. So that's why IP address was changed and discovery source was changed as well, because we updated this record with SMS. All right, so let's go back to my script again. Hit the back button for my instance. And I'm going to change this now to, I'm going to leave it at computer 2, and I'm going to change this IP address to 16, and change this discovery source, or your source, to back to ServiceNow. So now that we have a new discovery source for ServiceNow, what do you think is going to happen? All right. So if I run this script, go back to my list of CIs, hit refresh list. All right, so now, because that name was computer 2 and the discovery source was ServiceNow, the host name was changed, but the IP address was not changed. Again, ServiceNow has the authoritative capability to populate the host name, but not the IP address. So that's why the IP address did not change, because SMS has authoritative capability to overwrite that only. All right. So this is a good way to test out your rules to make sure that they are functioning correctly. All right.
We just covered CMDB. What is the CMDB? We covered the governance, and we also covered population. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mike to talk about CMDB health.
Thanks, Steve. So really, as we've mentioned a lot of times today, it's wonderful to have all this data in your CMDB, and there's a ton of value that you as an organization can derive out of handling and having that database in your CMDB. However, a lot of that becomes invalidated if you don't manage and maintain the health of your CMDB and ensure that the data that you have entered into the CMDB is constantly being updated and ensuring that it's sufficient for the business case that you set out at the beginning of your CMDB program. So to that end, we're going to talk through some of the potential things that you can utilize that the platform provides for you to be able to manage and maintain that. But first things first, we're actually going to kick it off with a poll. And this poll really talks about service ownership. This is something we talked about earlier about have you started defining the services within your platform? But now we really are talking about do you have people within your organization that are designated as owners over those particular services and have responsibility around the health and care and feeding of those services? So, the first is we don't even have services. The second is we've talked about it, but nobody's, officially assigned. Then we've had, we have service owners for those specific application services. And then we have service owners for both app services and business services. So we'll give folks a bit of time in order to get those that poll answered, and we can kind of talk through some of the results that we're getting as part of that Q&A. Let's take a look and see if we're starting to get answers to the poll yet. Oh, I don't see that the poll's been launched. Let me kick that off. Let's try that again. Okay, there we go. So now you can actually start answering the poll, and we'll give folks probably about 30 seconds or so to get some answers in there. And then we can talk about and see where everyone is along their service ownership journey and who has services defined. And I'm going to take a quick drink of water while we wait for that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. We've got about 50% of folks voted. So let's go ahead and share those results. So as I said, it looks like the vast majority is we have service owners for the application services. So that's really good. So that means a lot of folks are, really down the journey of looking at this kind of from a service management perspective. And then, close seconds are, we've got some services assigned, but no official owners. And then we have 25%. So roughly a quarter of the respondents are already down the path of having application and business services with service owners, which is fantastic. So that last 12% where we don't even really have services defined today, I recommend that you guys, really look closely at how you can transform your operations by moving towards a more service-oriented operations management capability. And that can really help progress down that maturity and that availability level. So that being said, let's shift gears now and talk about the CMDB dashboard. So I'm going to stop sharing those results. And we're going to talk about what's the CMDB health dashboard, what are the criteria that we're looking at, and how are we utilizing that in order to ensure that the CMDB is still meeting our organizational needs. So it's really broken down across 3 different categories, right? Completeness, compliance, and correctness. And I won't read you all of this because I'm going to really shorten it up and give you the kind of the nugget of what it is, right? At its core, completeness is, do we have the data that we need? Compliance is it built in a way that it meets our purpose? And correctness is the data that we have accurate and up to date? So I'll dig into each of these kind of 3 sections and we'll walk through what that looks like, how we get that. Oh, that's quite odd. Can you see that better now?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Good catch, folks. So let me then walk through each of those categories and make sure that we talk through each of them, talk about how it's built out, and then get everyone available to start working through the lab. So let's talk about completeness. How do we set it up and what does it really mean, right? So a CI is really only complete if we have both the required and recommended fields that are totally populated for that CI. So for instance, a recommended field, it might be who the owner is or which cost center that's assigned to, those kinds of things. Those are great fields to have on your environment, but not necessarily absolutely required in order to be able to manage and maintain those CIs. So the required or mandatory fields are completely global, meaning that once you set it to required for that CI class, everywhere in the platform that is now required. And so as a result, anytime that it's on a form, it must be filled out. And however, we still have issues where at times required fields are actually empty. And so we have this audit process, this completeness process to be able to point that out. And that can happen due to direct updates to the table. like some of the older third-party integrations that write data directly to the table have the capability to insert records that do not have the required field set. So that's a concern. And in addition to that, there are inserts from script includes that can cause that problem. So that being said, understanding what those are and how that folds into the health of your CMD is important. And then looking at compliance, right? Compliance is really about, is this CI built out in the way that meets our organizational requirements, right? So things like, does it have antivirus installed on it? All Linux servers must be within a certain patch level, right? Or all servers, if they're in production, they also have to have a matching QA server. So you can go in and we'll walk through at a high level during the lab, explaining how to build some of these compliance rules to show that and to explain what that audit process looks like. And then from there, we'll show you how to expand on that so that you can build those for your own organization. And then the third is really correctness, right? So this is the data accurate, right? Do we have duplicates in the environment? Are there orphan CIs, meaning that there are CIs that are not related to a business service or they don't have any other dependent relationships, those sorts of things. And then staleness, which is a configurable item, and we'll talk how to set that up. But essentially, how long has it been since we actually discovered this CI and saw it in the wild? And if it's been too long, chances are fairly likely that either it's been retired or the data that we have in the CMDB is out of date and therefore wouldn't be usable in the event of needing to do some troubleshooting with it. So let's talk now about how do we configure the dashboard and what's the baseline process for that. So the first and foremost, the key thing is to understand and build out what your health metrics are. What is really required for you as an organization to be able to give that record a thumbs up to say that has all the information that we need in order to be able to support that CI. And so we'll do that we'll walk through this as part of the lab by configuring the health inclusion rules, which CI classes get evaluated. And then we'll talk about setting your required and recommended fields, looking at what is classified as old and building out these orphan rules so that you can understand what the critical relationships are for managing your infrastructure. And then finally, we'll kind of talk about kicking off those jobs. So let's dig into the health inclusion rules. So as we've already talked about with a lot of the customers in the Q&A today, lots of folks have thousands, if not millions of CIs in their CMDBs. And so building health inclusion rules that cover all of those classes is likely not going to be helpful and useful because there's a lot of data in there that, while may necessarily be good for us to track and understand, it may not be required for mission critical management and maintenance of your infrastructure. So therefore, we really want to limit the health inclusion rules to the core classes that you're interested in ensuring that you have all the necessary data on, right? So in this particular case, we have applications and servers and VMs highlighted as things that we really need to clearly have accuracy on that data and information. So, and then start to think about, based on those core classes that are critical, what are the required and recommended fields for those? And how should we be setting this up, again, to ensure that we have all the data necessary in order to meet our organizational goals that we set out at the onset of our CMDB program, right? And it's important to know that where you set these in the hierarchy is very, very important, because all of them are all inherited by all the child classes. So if you set it at the CMDB CI level, every single CI record is going to have that inherited by default. So you want to make sure that you're setting it in the right place so that you have the right data necessary in order to have that overlap, but not causing conflicts around what's actually required with other CI classes. So we've talked a bit about required fields, but from a general governance perspective, we highly recommend that your required fields should be automatically populated, right? Anything that you absolutely have to have as an organization in order to manage your infrastructure should not rely on human intervention in order to populate it appropriately. And you want to have as few required fields as possible, right? Ensure that you really, truly actually need that data in order to manage your infrastructure before you make it a required field. Recommended fields, on the other hand, they don't have any real impact on the platform other than at the health metrics level, right? So you can say, hey, we really should have who the CI class owner is. And that's not going to prevent you from filling out a CI because you don't know who the owner is. But it will say, hey, we don't have all the information on this particular CI because this recommended field is not filled in. So understanding where that is and how that makes sense to your organization is important. And, it could be information that might be useful for troubleshooting or communicating issues with a particular CI to the rest of the organization. But again, they shouldn't necessarily be mandatory. And you can use it as a way to say, maybe this should be a required field. So let's first make it recommended and see how many CIs we're getting that information on and see what changes may be required to the process in order to ensure that we can make this a required field and get that data on every CI. And then similar to the required fields, you should have a process. Now, it doesn't have to be automated, but you really should have a defined process on how those fields are going to be populated. In this case, it's okay to have it be a manual process, especially when you're thinking about that testing ground for required fields. It may be, let's start with making a manual process. Let's make it a recommended field. Once we're comfortable with that, then we can move that into an automated process and make it a required field. So now that we've kind of talked at a high level about required and recommended fields, let's move on to staleness, right? So as we've talked about before, the number one way to kill a CMDB program is to have data in there that's just not useful for the rest of the organization, right? So ensuring that the data is up to date and accurate is absolutely critical to maintaining the health of your CMDB program. So, I've had this conversation with lots of customers in my time here where folks say, well, we're manually populating these particular CIs and here's why, and these kinds of things. And 9 times out of 10, I said, by the time you're done filling out that information in the CMDB, once you're done populating those CIs, it's already changed and the data is no longer of use, right? So understanding how frequently your data changes, how frequently your infrastructure changes, and then building your staleness rules in order to match that is really, really key. So by default, out of the box, all CIs have a 60-day staleness rule. And you can change that on a class-by-class basis. I think 60 days is a little long in the tooth for as far as I'm concerned, but at the very least, we have a standard out-of-the-box configuration, and you can dial it to meet your organization's needs. The key thing is to understand how frequently that information changes and how frequently your teams are looking at that information in order to be able to manage and maintain that infrastructure. So let's talk about orphan rules. So when you're thinking about how you're managing your infrastructure and how that relates to the CMDB, when you're thinking about things like problem, incidents, and changes, right? The understanding of what those relationships are and what the potential impact upstream and downstream of incidents and problems and changes is really, really critical. And it's one of the great values that a CMDB can provide to an organization. And so without that dependency information in the environment, you're limiting some of the value of the CMDB. So ensuring that we have this rule set around raising red flags when there are orphan CIs without the necessary relationships is really, really important. So think about what data you need to ingest and what those relationships are required in order to troubleshoot and manage issues, and then how you're going to ensure that those relationships are in place. So again, data and data cleanliness and data health is paramount in managing your CMDB. And one of those ways is by utilizing what we call the duplicate remediator. And we'll dig into it a little bit more in just a minute, but there is a wizard now that walks you through remediating duplicate CIs that are found within the platform to be able to quickly and easily collapse those down without losing the data and maintaining an audit trail on how this information was changed and why this was collapsed. So we're going to jump into a couple of remediation options around how we're going to go through and remediate issues within the CMDB. And this is something that we'll also do in some of the labs here in just a few moments to kind of walk through how to build some of these remediations and what that looks like. So first things first are the remediation workflows that are available. So there are workflows that you can have triggered out of the platform based on certain criteria that occur within the CMDB. So things like you can create follow-on tasks and say, hey, this condition has occurred, and so we're going to kick off a follow-on task for somebody to go and update it or can do additional work. We can also do things based on orphan data. We can also do things based on whether or not recommended or required fields are within the platform and properly filled out. And then, of course, duplicates and staleness. You can, and we recommend, start off with a manual execution, build the workflow, understand what it looks like, understand what the requirements are, and then set it up for a manual execution process so that you can manually remediate that. And then once you've really got that process dialed in, then you go through and start automating it and ensuring that no humans are required in order to keep that data up to date and healthy. We talked about this a minute ago, but I want to dig in a little bit deeper on the duplicate CI remediator. It just shows here a little bit of the wizard itself and understanding how this is all laid out. So it's a great little wizard that lets you, it shows you here's a set of duplicate CIs, and you can actually walk through these kind of guided steps that say, here's the various attributes that you want to use. Here's how we're going to merge what values from here to here. Here's how we're going to merge what relationships. And then finally maintain all that audit trail. And there's actually a great Knowledge 18 lab that walks through that feature and shows you the whole process from beginning to end. And that link will be available in the slide deck that we provide out as part of the thank you email when we wrap this up next. It should come to you tomorrow. So just as a quick reminder, you should get a thank you email with all the information from today. It should have a recording of this session. It should have a link, it should have a copy of this slide deck with a lot of the links and information in it as well. And the labs are also going to be available to you until tomorrow at noon. So definitely feel free to continue to learn and dig into the information that we're providing today. So we've talked about kind of how do you remediate that information and some of the options that are available and automatically within the platform, both from a manual process and from an automated process. But there's also another great thing that we can do that's called data certification. And really, data certification is a process that is a scheduled process that does the on-demand validations of the data within the CMDB. So this is usually done in order to maintain data that's not ingested automatically via discovery process or via a third-party integration of some kind. So this is things like who the service owner should be, and who, what the purchase order was, or any of that sort of ancillary information that's good to know about a particular CI, but not necessarily discoverable in any way, shape, or form. So what that does is that kicks off a process, then you can send it to specific assigned groups for them to go through and do the verification of that data and certify, yes, the data is still accurate, and then move on. So it's a great way for you to ensure that the data, again, still meets the needs of the organization as it was set out at the outset of your CMDB program. Another great thing that the platform has, and again, this is something that we're going to be showing you as part of the labs, are desired states. And this really flows into the correctness, the compliance health metrics within your CMDB dashboard, right? So you can build, and we'll walk through this process, you can build desired state rule sets as part of your compliance rules to say things like all machines must have a antivirus installed or something like that. And so what that does is it will then show us, here's a listing of all the laptops that don't have antivirus installed on it, or here's all the servers that don't have antivirus installed on it. So the capability to be able to kind of do some of that desired state and audit management is really powerful, especially in organizations that have kind of higher security requirements. The ability to have this as an automated process that automatically goes off in the background and gives you visibility into where things are deviating from the expected state is really, really powerful. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start us walking into the labs here. And I'm going to pause my screen sharing for just a moment while I do that. So definitely, you guys have already done a great job of this so far, but when we get in here, and if you've run into any issues and I am not sharing my screen, don't hesitate to jump in and shout out at me. So we're going to start off on lab 5, which should be page 22 in the lab guide. And let me get my screen resharing again here. So lab 5, right? And what this is going to do, and the intention of this, is to walk through the process of configuring your inclusion rules and your health inclusion rules, and also to ensure we understand what completeness looks like for particular CI classes. And we'll talk through that a bit as we go. So first things first, we're going to go to the CI class manager, right? And give that a second to pop up. And we're going to open up the hierarchy here. And because we want this to be against every single CI within our CMDB, we're going to configure it at the configuration item level, right? That very highest point in the hierarchy. So that way we know it'll get inherited by every single other class underneath that. So we're going to go ahead and expand this health section, and we're going to click on health inclusion rules. So, so we don't want to necessarily do health inclusion against every single class in the CI, again, because in the CMDB, because again, there's a lot of data, but it doesn't necessarily all apply to us as an organization. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn on all of these metrics. However, we are going to add in some specific classes. So we're going to set class here is, and we're going to set this to Windows Server. Okay. And then because we want to have multiples, we're going to do it as an OR. And I love that it keeps the same class. So now we're going to look for Linux servers. Great. And we're also going to add in classes computer. Okay. So what that means is we're only going to run these inclusion rules against those classes. So we're going to go ahead and click save. And so now we see these health inclusion rules and where it applies to and what domain it's sitting in. So now we want to add in some specific things to the Linux server. So we're going to go back into our hierarchy here. We're going to look for Linux server, jump down to that. Okay. And now we're going to go into completeness under the health setting here. And in this particular case, we want to set this recommended field. We want to set assigned to, because we want to, again, this only impacts the health scores for this. It does not make this a required field. It doesn't change anything else in the platform. It just says if assigned to is not filled out for a Linux server CI, we're going to call that an incomplete CI record. So we'll add that into our recommended fields here, and we're going to hit save. And then we're going to go back to the attributes for this. And under the added, where these are the specific fields that were added by this class, these are not the inherited. We have this kernel release string here, right? And we want to ensure that the kernel release is included on every single Linux server CI that gets added in. So we're going to make this a mandatory field. And now, not only is this going to be completed in our health metrics, included in our health metrics, but anywhere where there's a form for a Linux server CI class on the platform, that will now be a mandatory field, and you won't be able to populate, or excuse me, you won't be able to create the record without it. Again, don't forget, there are ways to circumvent that. So that's why we have the rules in the health dashboard to ensure that we're keeping an eye on that and tracking that. So we've done that. And now we've completed lab 5. I'll give you guys, a couple of 30 seconds or so in order to finish lab 5, and I'll start prepping for lab 6. And I'm going to take a drink of water because I've been talking too much. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go and talk about some of those audit pieces, right? The compliance, and we're going to show some of those desired state things that we were talking about to ensure that, again, that the CI is configured the way that we expect it to be configured as an organization. And this gives us the capability to report on some of that and throw some red flags. So again, we're going to go back to the class manager, and we're going to open up the hierarchy. And this time we're going to look at server. Okay. And this time we're going to look at this particular server rule. And we're going to go down to this compliance section under health. And we've now got this list of different servers with these certification filters. That is essentially what groups of servers we want to look at. But first we're going to build this template, which basically shows what are we going to check against, right? So we're going to go ahead and click new on this certification template. And the name we're going to give it is Running McAfee Antivirus. No jokes at my terrible typing and spelling while I've got an audience here. All servers must run antivirus. See, there I go. Software. Okay. And then we're going to pick the filter. Again, that's to limit it to which specific servers we're looking for. And that's kind of interesting. When you see it in here, it says all servers -2, but we're looking for the second to the last filter, all servers. Okay, so now we've done that. So now we're going to go ahead and click submit here. But I missed one important part. Jumping ahead of myself. So we need to go down to this certification related list conditions and double click in here in order to insert a new row. And so what we need is software installed and the name contains McAfee virus scan. Okay. All right. Again, I always have to double check my spelling. All right. So we got that. So now we'll click update. So now that we've created the certification template, now we're going to create an audit rule that uses that certification template in order to build our report. So we'll go into audit and we will create a new audit that is going to use that template that we just built out. So we will call it verify McAfee antivirus. The template, we'll use this lovely search field here, running McAfee antivirus. Okay, and again, we want to make sure we're looking at the CMDB CI server table, and we are going to want to create tasks for that. So any server that does not meet the audit criteria is going to kick off a task that we can have assigned to specific groups in order to say, hey, go solve this problem. So the assignment type, we're going to set to assigned to, and then we're going to create an unassigned task. All right. And then of course, you know, we'll be nice and give it a description here. Okay. So we've got that. And now we're going to go ahead and hit submit. And it says that you can run the audit from here, but I like to just make sure it gets saved and then I go back in and run the audit. Maybe. There we go. Now, give it a second to finish loading there. Okay. Click run audit. All right. So it's going through and it's kicking that off. So now we've got that completed. We can now go in here and we will start to see audit results. So you'll see that we have 179 servers that, hey, you guys not following your compliance properly, not running McAfee antivirus. And we've created follow-on tasks for each of those that can then be assigned to the appropriate folks to be able to go and remediate those issues. All right, so that brings us to the end of Lab 6, where we've talked about how to build out those compliance rules, how to set up your audits in order to ensure that all of your CIs are meeting the criteria that you've set forth as an organization in order to ensure that it's built the way that you expect it to be built. Again, that can be very, very good for folks who have, you know, actual compliance requirements, PCI, DSS, those kinds of things. So you can trigger some specific warnings for specific things that could be an issue for you. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go and we're going to just kind of walk through some of the correctness pieces and look at things like staleness and some of those other configurations in Lab 7. So we'll jump into that. We'll open up this hierarchy again, and we're going to look for Linux server. Okay. And then from there, this is a quick and short lab. We're going to go into the correctness section here in health. And you'll see here, we've got our staleness rule. And it, by default is configured for a 60-day staleness. That's out of the box. If we wanted to, we could configure it here and make some changes to that. We're not going to do that today. This is just to show you, here's where you can view the staleness settings. And if you have any questions about that, we can change it elsewhere. All right, let's jump into Lab 8, which is our last lab for this section. And then we'll talk about some reporting and then we'll jump back into the final lab, which is going to be lab 9. So this one's a little bit more involved because we're going to actually build some remediation workflows based on the staleness rule. So as CIs become stale, we'll build this workflow that we can first manually trigger and then eventually automatically trigger to ensure that we can build some remediation workflows around those stale CIs. So we're going to go into health preferences from the navigator here, right? And then over here on the right-hand side, we're going to look at health metrics. And then in this metric dropdown, we're going to look at staleness. Okay. And from here, we right now are not configured to create tasks for these, but we're going to change that now. So we're going to click this to enable that, and we're going to have those tasks set to the change management assignee group. And then we'll go ahead and click save. Okay, so now as that occurs, we'll be able to see these tasks that are going to go ahead and get assigned to the change management group. But the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually build the remediation workflow that we're going to be working with in order to do the work on those CIs once they're stale. So we're going to start by opening up the workflow editor. Okay, and you can see the various workflows that are already here on the platform, but we're going to create a new workflow. And we're going to just call it remediate stale CI. And the table is going to be stale CI. Okay. And then we're going to say remediate CI that is stale. All right. So, and then we're going to go ahead and click submit. So that's kind of built the shell of the workflow, right? We now have a start and end. And on the right-hand side here, we're going to click on this core piece, right? And we're going to look for run script, which will be under utilities, run script. And we're just going to drag it out here. All right. And at this point, we'll call the script remediate stale CI. And we're not going to worry about stage. We're going to copy and paste in the script from the PDF. And it always does this to me. Not quite sure why, but this CI update should be on a new line. Okay, so once that's completed, just double check it, make sure that everything's good. I'm going to go ahead and hit submit. And now we have this capability. However, the script goes straight from start to end. The workflow does, which is not quite what we want. So we're going to go ahead and click on that line and delete that. And then we're going to drag this over to here. So it'll go from begin to run script. And then we're going to drag this over to end, right? So now we have the flow so that it will flow all the way through our run script. So we'll do that. And then we will ensure that it's published. So we'll go ahead and click publish so that it'll be available to run on the rest of the platform. All right, and now that state has changed to published. So excellent. Now what we're going to do, because this opened in a new tab, we can just close this tab, which is great. And we can go to CMDB remediations. All right. So this is where you can actually build CMDB remediation rules within the platform for managing these kinds of issues that pop up. So we're going to go ahead and click new here, and we're going to call this remediate stale CI. And Task type is going to be stale CI remediation. And then we're just going to give it this workflow that we've already built, which is going to be remediate stale CI. Okay, and right now we have it set to manual execution. So we'll go ahead and we'll click submit on that. All right. And now that is set. But we don't have any jobs that are running to check the health. We've configured how those health jobs should be set, but they're not actually set to run yet. So we have to go and get those kicked off and make sure that they're actually running and can provide data and give us the ability to trigger some workflows. So we're going to go back to the health preference section. And this time we're going to click on the scheduled job section. And then it says to start off with correctness, but it doesn't really matter because we're going to go through and we're going to execute all of them. So execute now, completeness, execute now, and compliance. I said all of them, but I'm not correct. We're only going to do correctness, completeness, and compliance. Okay. So now what we can do here is let's give us a way to check the status of those and see how they are progressing. So we're going to do CMDB health metric underscore status underscore dot capital list to open it up into a new tab. And then we are going to just keep refreshing this until all of these in progress ones show complete. Okay, and actually let's just do this. Let's filter out the false records. Okay, so all of our currently active processes are now completed. So we should have some data now in our CMDB dashboard. So we'll go ahead and we'll close this new tab because that opened it in a new tab. When you do list in all caps, it opens it out into a new tab. Handy dandy. So we're going to go CMDB view. Ooh, if I can type CMDB view. All right. And now we're going to take a look at the CMDB health dashboard. And it's going to differ slightly from the lab guide. However, it's roughly accurate in that our health is overall is 58%. Our completeness is actually quite good. Our correctness is doing all right, but our compliance is really where we're falling down. Because in particular, though there's a large number of those servers that are not running antivirus and that are failing the audit records that we have set up in order to show whether or not those CIs are configured in the way that we expect them to be configured as an organization. And I do want to just mention that we are going to have another break after I'm done with this lab to ensure that everybody has time to sort of catch up a little bit, get some of those pieces completed, ask some additional questions. So I apologize if I'm zipping through this a little too quickly, but we'll give you some time to catch up and ask more questions.
Also, hey, let me jump in here, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
If you are not caught up and you are struggling to watch what Mike is doing and what you're doing as well, I would recommend that you stop doing your lab and watch what Mike may be doing. That way you understand the concept, and then go to the labs when we have it at the small break. Okay.
Good idea. Okay, so now what we're going to do, we've got all this data in here. We have some great information about the health of our CMDB and how it's all working. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go and look at, in particular, some of those stale CIs and the tasks that were created based on our process. So when we click on those stale CIs, let me go back. I seem to have missed something here. Let's go back to our dashboard. Okay. So when we look at the stale CIs now, there we go. So now we've got all of these stale CIs when the last time they were evaluated, right? And then it's going to show what those individual underlying tasks are that were actually assigned to and billed based out of that. So we've got this task. It's been generated. It says, hey, this was not updated in the last 60 days. And you can actually look at the individual CI that it was assigned to here. But we can now click this remediate button. Remediate stale CI. And now it's kicked off. So what we can do is now we can open this record for this MacBook Pro 17-inch. And we can't see it yet. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to configure this form layout so that we can see the field properly. But once we've got this configured, we should be able to see the field that shows the operational status of that, not operating system, operational status. Let's go ahead and add it to the very end there. So because this field, this CI is now listed as stale, and we ran the remediation workflow against that, that remediation workflow went in and automatically set the operational status to that as non-operational. So that way our team can know to be wary of that information in that, because we haven't discovered it in quite some time, and it's likely that it's not operational or the data is dramatically out of date and not useful. So you can now see, some of the pieces around managing the data that's being put into the CMDB, being able to turn on those health inclusion rules, configure which classes those health inclusion rules are run against, how to build some audits and some audit templates in order to check against, is the CI configured in a way that meets our organizational requirements? Also, how to configure the staleness, and to even build a workflow around some remediation for CIs that are stale. And that same process can be used with almost every state for a CI around generating workflows and assigning tasks to folks in order to remediate common issues. This next section that we're going to talk about is really going to cover a lot around the CMDB and getting inventory and reporting, right? So again, it's great. You've ingested a ton of data around what's in your entire technology portfolio. You're managing it with discovery, and you're ingesting all of that data using various resources, and you're staying on top of the health using the health dashboard. But now somebody comes running down to you and says, oh my gosh, we need to know how many web servers we have in the environment, and we need to know what Linux servers they're running on. You say, I got you covered. So that's really where the CMDB reporting comes into play. So the CMDB reporting has what we call the CMDB query builder, which is incredibly powerful to be able to do queries based on what the relationships are within your CMDB, what types of CIs, what various classes they are, and then really be able to get down into what those relationships look like and see the whole full stack of visibility in your environment, which is a great way to look at things like, change management and understanding potential impacts of change management, and also understanding, incident and problem management around what those larger impacts are. So visibility is actually key. And then there's another capability called the CMDB browse feature. And the great thing about that is it actually gives you a really nice kind of one-stop shop for all the information that you might need out of a particular CI. And so it's got a ton of different ways to kind of slice and dice the data, things like health widgets, timeline views around what things are occurring when and where, lists of incidents and problems and other things. Me personally, I actually really like the CMDB dashboard, which is what I'm going to show you next, that has a lot of these very similar things. So the CMDB dashboard, once you've got a CI record and you're looking at a specific CI record, at the top there, you can ordinarily by default, it opens to form. You can click that dashboard button and it's going to give you a ton of great little widgets around, the staleness, any duplicates, a great mapping all of the various relationships that are related to that particular CI. And one of my favorites is that the timeline of events down there that's highlighted in red, which can actually show changes. It shows changes to that CI and updates to the data in the CI. And if it's done outside of an approved change window, it'll actually show that this was an unapproved change, and it shows you which fields were changed and when. So it's a great way for you to look at some of those capabilities and what the status is and what that kind of like audit trail is on a CI. So that's a lot of great information around the query builder itself. But the next thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to dive into a lab, walking through the CMDB query builder, kind of peeling apart a little bit how we build one of those queries out and then run it, and talk about how you can kind of build those as a repeatable query that can be used on a regular basis. So to that end, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this, and I'm going to get back to sharing my lab instance. Give me 1 second. Okay, so lab instance here. So you can see where we ended off with this CI in the last lab. But for this particular lab, what we're going to do is we're going to start off by going to, and again, don't forget we're on lab 9 if you're following along in your lab guides. We are going to start off by going to the CMDB query builder. Right. And again, this opens in a new tab, which is great. When we're done with this, we can just close it out and go back to the primary platform. And what you'll see is if there were queries that I knew were going to be running on a regular basis, like, how many Microsoft SQL instances do we have in our environment, and what versions are they running, and look at the relationships around those. If I were going to run that on a regular basis, I could save this as a saved query and just continually run it over and again on a regular basis in order to report on that as needed. But in this particular case, because we don't have any saved queries, we're going to go ahead and click this Create New button here. And we're going to do a CMDB query. We're not talking about service mapping today, so we're just going to specify a CMDB query. So we're going to go ahead and enter web servers. It's in my autocomplete because I've done this a few times. So web servers, we're going to create, and now that gives us again an empty canvas similar to what we were seeing in the workflow creation. And you'll notice on the left-hand side here, there are the CMDB classes that you can utilize and look at, but there are also some non-CMDB tables that you could potentially look at, like you might want to look for all servers that have currently open changes on them, or with anything that's got an instance, or an incident open against it. Those kinds of things, we can use that here. And then there are also some particular saved service queries that we can look at. In this particular case, though, we're going to start by we're going to look for server. And you'll know there's multiple of these, right? So we're going to want to look for the one that's under the hardware tree, right? Hardware, computer, server. This is it here. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag that out onto the canvas here. Okay. So we're saying, hey, we want server 1. And then now we're going to look for web server. So same thing, web server. And again, that's under infrastructure service. So we want to make sure we drag that out here as well. And now from here, now we need to understand what the relationship is and understand and build out the mapping to show what relationship we want more. So first we're going to click on this web server 1. And when we do that, it gives us this little box on the right-hand side. So we're going to click on that. And then we're going to click on server 1 on the left-hand side here, right? And so now it draws that relationship in between the two. And we want to ensure that we click on this add relationships types here. And we want to say runs on runs, right? So the parent is going to be web server 1. The child is going to be server 1. We're going to look specifically for first level relationships that are showing the runs on runs type of relationship. So now we've got that built out. We can see what that map looks like. We're going to go ahead and save it because we may want to run this in the future. And now we should see, oh, not quite yet. Now we want to run it. Oh, yes, I have to pick a starting node. Okay, and hit run. Web server 1. All right. So as a result here, we now have this web server Apache Linux Den 200, and it is running on Linux 100 server. So we now have a report that shows us here's the web servers. We may potentially have more web servers, but in this particular case, we just have this one, and we can see which server it's running on, and we can see those relationships and understand kind of how to report on that, how to filter it, and how to show there. So very quick, very short lab there. You can kind of tinker with it more if you'd like, because there's those query results open up in a new window. You can close that out. You can go back into here. You can look for specific databases. You can look for database servers, those kinds of infrastructure pieces, and really get to the ability to map that down and show a lot of the value around how we can tie things together from a CMDB query perspective.
Wanted to, kind of wrap up here today. We wanted to share with you some additional resources that you can leverage following this meeting. This was really meant to give you an introduction to CMDB best practices, but we have plenty of resources aligned with the CMDB, as well as the common service data model that you can take advantage of that are free of charge. One of the first things you want to do is visit our Customer Success Center. And inside of this deck here, you see on the bottom, I have a link to each of these things. This Customer Success Center has lots of great resources across ServiceNow, regardless of what topic you're interested in. You can find anything here, from best practices for implementation of ServiceNow products to on how to create a center of excellence to manage your ServiceNow environment, and really just anything you can imagine is really in here. We talked earlier in this course about there being a CMDB fundamentals course. This is what we call a learning path, which consists of several different courses. I think it says it's about 12 hours long, but you can, it's 22 hours long, but you can finish that in a much shortened period of time. Some of the same labs that you took today, you'll find in this section as well, if you wanted a refresher after tomorrow's lab instances expire. And that's on Now Learning, which is where we've transitioned all of our learning courses to. Next, we have a Now Learning course on the CSDM 3.0 fundamentals. This course was just updated for 3.0 recently, and some of the things that it goes into here is what is the service data model, but it also includes things like product views, which are essentially how each of the ServiceNow solutions leverages the CSDM. Rico had talked about Integration Hub ETL as part of his section today. And this is a way to import data from third-party systems into ServiceNow, specifically into the CMDB, the right way. We talked about service graph connectors that are certified connectors that are available to you if you have the right subscription model. The Integration Hub ETL is another way of doing it. Think of it as a build versus buy scenario where you could use Integration Hub ETL for. We have a course and a lab available for you through our Knowledge 20 system. We created a configuration management and CMDB for Dummies ebook. You did, as part of your registration gift, you'll be receiving a copy of this. I have a copy here. This will be sent to your address. So when you get the email, you'll be sent to a link to register for your address, right? So don't worry about if your ServiceNow registered address is your work. You can put in your home address as well. The CSDM, we have a forum on our ServiceNow community, right? So the community for ServiceNow in general is a way for, it's a curated knowledge base of customers and partners asking questions and people answering questions, and they could be SMEs from ServiceNow, partners, or other customers, answering those questions. We have a specific common service data model forum where you can get the white paper from, as well as look through the content to see what kind of questions were asked, as well as ask your own questions. We oftentimes are asked as SCs, how do I model out this specific scenario, right? Well, this is a great resource to ask that as well. Within the community, we have additional best practice resources. CMDB 101, it's a best practice series, as well as a best practice series if you're using discovery and service mapping. We recently conducted, over the summer, we conducted our knowledge conference virtually this year. And we have a big on-demand library for IT operations management solutions. The CMDB is where if you just search for the word CMDB, you'll find it there. But you'll find a lot of things from customers, from ServiceNow ourselves about how to create CMDB best practices. One of the things we just released recently with Paris is a set of dashboards you can download from the ServiceNow store free of charge. These are what we call data foundation dashboards. The CMDB one looks at things like how many CIs were processed through the IRE. It looks at other health metrics as well, like around duplicates, for example, right? Think of it as a condensed version of the health metrics, but also including some other areas that will help you understand the health of your CMDB. And the CSDM side of the house looks at, if you take the CSDM course, you'll notice that the course walks you through a crawl, walk, run, fly approach. This dashboard has 4 tabs on it so that you could see how your data is modeled in the CMDB aligning with the CSDM methodology. And finally, we also wanted to mention to you some of the service offerings that are available to you. These are things where you would reach out to your ServiceNow account team to discuss further. One would be a CMDB health scan. So that looks at specifically scanning your CMDB for any customizations you've made, and you'll see recommendations on how to fix those. I tune up your CMDB engagement. It's a very, very low cost engagement that you could buy from the ServiceNow store, as well as certainly working with one of our great partners for them to come in and do a CMDB assessment and put a plan in place for you to get back on the right track. The key takeaways from today. We talked about this in multiple sections of today's workshop, right? The critical few versus the trivial many. Only put data in the CMDB that you're going to manage, data that is going to drive value for an outcome for your business, right? Don't boil the ocean. Don't just throw a bunch of data in there that you don't need. Automate the CMDB population as much as possible, right? 90% of the attributes in your CMDB should be automated. They should be discovered through some type of discovery tool, right? Because you want as near real-time updates as possible from what exists in your environment. And then finally, we talked just now about managing the health, right? You want to make sure that your CMDB data remains accurate and trustworthy. And one of the best ways to do that is to look at the health, right? So what Mike went through with managing the CMDB health, right? You want to make sure that you turn that on. That's core platform functionality that even if you're not using ServiceNow Discovery, you can start to leverage and manage your CMDB health. And with that, we wanted to really say a huge thank you for coming today. I know it was a huge chunk of time today. We hope you found this valuable. One of the things we also wanted to mention is we are looking to revise this workshop for 2021. So start to look for invites to those sessions starting next year, right? It'll be a revised workshop, focusing on more of our latest technologies as we continue to evolve, right? But also learning from best practices from our customers as well as from industry best practices and letting you all know about that. With that said, we know we have about 1 minute left. I wanted to thank you guys. And once again, you will be receiving an email to register your address to get this book as well as some other swag coming your way. We'd love to do this in person, but these days we have to do this remotely. So we cannot wait to get back in front of you guys again and talk to you in person and have a great conversation about the CMDB. So with that said, thank you everyone, and we will see you soon.